Chapter 1. The rain over Ko Academy fell in a fine mist that night, the kind that blurred streetlights into halos and made the old school building look like something out of a half-remembered dream. Issei Hyoudou stood beneath the cover of the front gate, waiting for a downpour that never quite arrived, and thought about how strange his life had become in the span of a single year. He was 18 now. Old enough, the underworld's elders liked to remind him, to be considered an adult by both human and devil law. Old enough to be making decisions that would echo for centuries rather than semesters. And yet here he was, hood pulled low against a drizzle that barely qualified as weather, replaying a conversation from that afternoon that had unsettled him more than any battle ever had. Sir's ex-Lucifer had visited the clubroom personally. That alone was unusual. The Crimson Satan rarely left the underworld except for matters of genuine consequence, and when he had folded himself into the small couch across from Issei with that easy, dangerous smile of his, Issei had known immediately that whatever came next would not be simple. "You are approaching a threshold," Sir's ex had said, swirling tea he had not touched. "Your power has grown beyond what any reincarnated devil should reasonably possess. Your bonds have grown alongside it. The underworld's nobility is beginning to ask what kind of house you intend to build, Issei Hyoudou. Not as Rias's pawn. As yourself?" Issei had not had an answer then. He still did not have one now, standing in the mist, watching his breath fog faintly in the cooling autumn air. What kind of house? What kind of family? The phrase kept turning over in his mind like a stone he could not stop touching. He had spent the early part of his life as a devil thinking in simple terms. Defeat the enemy. Protect the people he cared about. Become strong enough that nobody he loved would ever again be taken from him by a battle he had arrived at too late to win. Those goals had not changed. But the shape of what came after them had become enormous and strange, full of choices no 17-year-old pervert with a dragon arm had ever been prepared to make. Because the truth he had not said aloud to anyone yet, was this: the women who had shaped his life most deeply were not human. They had never pretended to be. Rias Gremory was a devil of the highest peerage, heir to a clan older than most human nations. Akeno Himejima carried the blood of a fallen angel and the blood of a Shinto thunder god in the same body, a duality she had spent years at war with before learning to hold both halves without flinching. Yasaka was the reigning leader of the nine-tailed kitsune of Kyoto, a being who had walked the earth since long before Japan had a name for itself. And Vanalene, the underworld's reclusive and infamous vampire duchess, was older than several of the religions Issei had personally seen proof of. None of them were ordinary by any definition. None of them needed him to save them, not really, not the way fairy tales promised damsels needed princes. They had needed something else from him, something he had only begun to understand. They needed someone who looked at the parts of themselves that were strange, ancient, monstrous by certain old definitions, and did not flinch. Did not see a devil's horns or a kitsune's tails or a vampire's hunger as something to be tolerated despite. They needed someone who saw all of it, and stayed. He had stayed. Again and again, in moments large and small, he had stayed. The question Sir's ex had actually been asking, dressed up in diplomatic language about thresholds and houses, was simpler and far more frightening than it sounded. Are you going to choose them? Truly choose them, the way nobility chooses heirs and consorts and futures, rather than drifting into something undefined because defining it felt too enormous to attempt. A familiar presence pulled him out of his thoughts. The faint, warm scent of cherry blossoms that never seemed to fade no matter the season, and beneath it something sharper, like ozone after lightning. You have been standing out here for 40 minutes, Issei. Akeno's voice carried that same teasing lilt it always did, though there was a careful note beneath it tonight, something searching. She stepped out from under the gate's overhang to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. She had changed out of her school uniform into a simple dark coat, her long black hair loose rather than tied, rain beating on it like scattered stars. Rias is starting to worry. She sent me to retrieve you, though I suspect she also wanted an excuse to stay inside where it is warm. Sorry. Got lost in my head. Issei managed a small smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes, and Akeno noticed. Akeno always noticed. Sir's ex-sama's visit shook you, she said. It was not a question. That obvious? You have worn that exact expression twice before. Once after the fight with Loki, when you realized how close we had all come to losing each other. And once after Valen nearly died in your arms during the Cows Brigade War. She tilted her head, studying him with the unsettling perceptiveness she had honed over a lifetime of reading rooms full of people who wanted to hurt her. It is the face you make when you are afraid of disappointing someone you love by making the wrong choice. Issei exhaled slowly. There was no point lying to her. There never had been, not since the first time she had looked past his perverted jokes and seen the boy underneath who was terrified of being ordinary, of being forgettable, of loving people and losing them anyway. He asked me what kind of house I intend to build, Issei admitted. Not Rias's peerage. Mine. My own house, my own line, my own future. He said the underworld's nobility is already talking about it. Akeno was quiet for a moment, rain misting silver in the streetlight between them. Then, softly, she said, "And what frightens you about that question?" "That I already know my answer," Issei said. "And I'm scared that knowing it makes me selfish." "You're a devil." Yasaka-san is the leader of an entire fox clan responsible for thousands of lives in Kyoto. Vanalene is vampire nobility who could have anyone in the underworld. Rias is heir to one of the 72 pillars. None of you needed to end up tangled in my mess of a life. And I keep thinking, who am I to want all of you to choose this too? To choose me, specifically, when none of you owe me that. Akeno's expression softened in a way that had nothing to do with teasing. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers cool from the rain, and laced them with his own without hesitation. "Issei," she said, "do you remember the day you found me on the roof of the old church ruins? The day I was ready to let Barakil believe I hated him forever rather than face what I actually was. I remember. You did not see a half-fallen angel who carried a curse in her blood. You did not see something to fix or to fear. You asked me what flavor of dango I liked best, and then you sat with me in silence until I was ready to talk." Her thumb traced slow, idle circles over the back of his hand. "Nobody had ever simply sat with me before, Issei. Not as something I needed to be managed through. Just sat with me, monster and angel and everything tangled in between, and let me be all of it at once without demanding I choose a single piece to perform." "Akeno, you are not selfish for wanting us," she said, cutting gently through his protest. "You would be selfish if you tried to keep us without ever asking what we wanted in return. But you have never done that. You have always asked. That is the difference between a man who collects people and a man who builds a home for them." She squeezed his hand. "So when Surzek-sama asks what kind of house you intend to build, I think you already know the only honest answer is this. A house built by someone who chose every single one of us on purpose, knowing exactly what we are, and never once asked us to be less than that to fit inside it." The mist had begun, finally, to thicken into real rain, soft against the stone path and the old gate above them. Issei looked at her for a long moment, at the rain in her dark hair and the steady warmth in her eyes that had never once, not in all the years he had known her, looked at him like he was something to be managed or endured. "I want to talk to all of you," he said finally. "Properly. Not drifting into this. Choosing it, out loud, the way Surzek's meant." Akeno's smile turned soft, genuine, entirely unguarded. "Then let us go inside before Rias decides we have eloped in the rain without her." They walked back toward the old school building together, hand in hand, the storm settling into a steady rhythm above them. Issei did not yet know how complicated the coming weeks would become, how many old laws and older grudges would rise up to test the house he was only beginning to imagine building. But for the first time since Surzek had left him with that impossible question, the fear in his chest had quieted into something closer to resolve. He was going to choose them. All of them, fully, with open eyes, and he was not going to let anyone, mortal or god or ancient law, tell him that the family he wanted to build was anything less than worth building. The old schoolhouse that served as the Occult Research Club's headquarters glowed warm against the rain when they arrived, light spilling gold from its tall windows onto the wet stone path. Issei could hear voices inside before he even reached the door, Rias's low and steady, threading through the comfortable noise of a household that had long since stopped feeling like a club and started feeling like exactly what Akeno had called it. A home. Rias looked up the moment the door opened, crimson hair catching the lamplight, and something in her face eased the instant she saw him. She had been worried. She always worried, quietly and without ever quite admitting it, whenever he wandered off alone with too much weighing on his mind. "There you are," she said, setting down the teacup she had not been drinking from either, apparently a family trait among the women in this room. "Akeno found you, I see." Standing in the rain, thinking too hard about everything as usual, Akeno said, releasing Issei's hand only to drape her coat over a chair, though she stayed close, the warmth between them not so easily set aside. Rias's eyes moved to Issei, sharp and searching in the particular way she had when she already suspected what weighed on someone but wanted them to say it themselves. "Surzex," she said simply. "Surzex," Issei agreed. She did not ask immediately what he had said. Instead she rose, crossed the room, and stood in front of Issei with the quiet authority of someone who had been raised from birth to read a room and steady it. "Whatever it is," she said, "you do not have to carry it alone tonight. Sit. Tell us. We are not going anywhere." It was such a small thing to say, and yet it undid something in Issei's chest that had been wound tight since that afternoon. He sat. Rias sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed warm against his arm, and Akeno settled on his other side, and for a moment the three of them simply existed together in the lamplight, while rain traced quiet lines down the windows. He told them everything Surzex had said. The threshold. The house. The question of what kind of future Issei intended to build, not as anyone's pawn or anyone's appendage, but as himself. Rias listened without interrupting, the way she always did when something mattered, her crimson eyes steady on his face the entire time. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly between her hands. "He asked me something similar, you know," she said finally. "Months ago. Before you ever knew. He asked if I understood what it meant that the boy I had reincarnated as my pawn had grown into something the old families could no longer dismiss as a curiosity." A small, wry smile touched her mouth. "I told him I understood it perfectly. I told him I had known it since the day you stood between me and Riser Phoenix, and refused to let anyone decide my future for me but myself. Rias, I am heir to the Gremory clan," she said simply. "I will inherit a great deal of responsibility, a great deal of expectation, and a great deal of old-fashioned thinking about what a proper devil house should look like. I have spent my entire life being told who I am allowed to want." Her hand found his, fingers lacing through his own the same unhurried way Akeno's had. "And then I met a boy who never once tried to tell me who to be. Who let me be a devil and a strategist and someone who is occasionally frightened and occasionally foolish, all at once, without demanding I trim myself down to fit his comfort." She looked at him then, crimson eyes bright in the lamplight, and there was no hesitation in her voice at all. "If you are asking whether I would choose to be part of the house you build, Issei, you do not need to ask. I chose that a long time ago. I am only waiting for you to be ready to say it where the whole world can hear." The rain kept falling outside, steady and soft, and inside the old schoolhouse 3 people who had once been strangers to each other sat close together in the warm light, and for the first time the future Surzex had asked about did not feel like an impossible wait. It felt, for just a moment, like something that had already quietly begun. Chapter 2. Kyoto in late autumn was a city of gold. The maple trees along the Kamo River had turned the color of old fire, and the air carried the particular sweetness of fallen leaves and wood smoke that Issei had come to associate, over the past several years, with one person in particular. He arrived at the edge of the Yukai district just past noon, the barrier that separated the hidden quarter from the ordinary tourist streets shimmering faintly as he passed through it, recognizing the seal etched into his palm from years of welcome. The transition was always strange and always wonderful, the modern city falling away behind him like a curtain drawn back to reveal something older and stranger, and, in its own way, more honest. Yasaka was waiting for him in the garden behind her residence, exactly where her attendants had told him she would be. She sat on the wooden engawa overlooking a pond full of slow, fat koi, 9 golden tails fanned around her in the autumn sun like something out of a painting too beautiful to be real. She did not look up when he approached, though he knew she had sensed him the moment he crossed the barrier. She always did. You have that look again, she said by way of greeting. The one you wear when something large and uncomfortable is rattling around in that head of yours. Word travels fast. Sirzex Lucifer does not visit Kyoto often, but when he does, he is not subtle about who he speaks with afterward. Yasaka finally turned to look at him, amber eyes warm with an affection that had only deepened over the years, ancient and patient in a way that always made Issei feel, paradoxically, more present rather than less. He came to me as well, you know. 3 days before he visited you. Issei blinked, surprised. He didn't mention that. He would not. Sirzex is many things, but he is careful never to make anyone feel as though their choices are being orchestrated from above, even when he is, in fact, gently orchestrating things from above. A small, knowing smile curved her mouth. He asked me whether the leader of Kyoto's yokai would object to being formally associated with the Devil's House. Whether old grudges between our peoples might complicate things, should matters between us become official rather than merely understood. What did you tell him? I told him that I have lived for over 1,000 years, Issei, and in all that time I have watched empires rise from nothing and crumble back into dust within a handful of centuries. I have watched gods quarrel and reconcile and quarrel again. I have buried more friends than most mortals will ever have the chance to make. She rose smoothly, the motion unhurried, and crossed the Engawit to stand before him, close enough that he could see the small flecks of deeper gold in her eyes. And in all that long, long life, I have met perhaps a handful of people who looked at me, at all 9 of these tales and everything ancient and strange that comes with them, and saw someone worth choosing rather than something to be managed, feared, or used as a political instrument. She reached up and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, the gesture achingly tender for someone who commanded the loyalty of an entire hidden quarter of one of Japan's great cities. You found me grieving Kuna's safety during the worst night of my life, when the Cows Brigade nearly burned this district to the ground, she said quietly. You did not see a goddess to be impressed by, or a political alliance to be cultivated. You saw a mother terrified for her daughter, and you fought like you would tear the sky open before you let anything happen to either of us. I decided that night, Issei, long before any talk of houses or futures. I decided I would not let a man who fought like that walk back out of my life simply because tradition says foxes and devils are not meant to build anything lasting together. Issei's throat felt tight. He had known, in the vague, hopeful way a person knows something they have not yet allowed themselves to fully believe, that Yasaka cared for him deeply. Hearing her say it so plainly, with that ancient and unshakable certainty, was different. Kanu, he said carefully, because it mattered, because it had always mattered. What does she think? At that, Yasaka actually laughed, bright and unguarded. My daughter has been asking me for 2 years when you intend to formally become her stepfather. She has, I am told, already informed several of the Kitsune children in the district that this is simply a matter of time. You will find her unbearably smug about it once matters are settled. Despite everything, despite the weight of the questions Sirzex had set rolling through his life, Issei laughed too, the sound surprised out of him. She told me last spring she was going to start training to inherit the 9 tails specifically so she could out-strategize me someday. She is your daughter in every way that matters already, whether the paperwork agrees yet or not, Yasaka said, and there was no teasing in it now, only a quiet, settled warmth. That is what I want you to understand, Issei. This is not merely about devils and foxes and ancient grudges between our kinds. It is about a family that has already been quietly building itself around you for years, waiting only for you to stop being afraid that wanting it makes you selfish. Akeno said something almost exactly like that to me last night. Because it is true, and because the people who love you best have apparently arrived at the same conclusion independently, which should perhaps tell you something. Yasaka's amber eyes softened further, and she took both his hands in hers, her grip warm and sure. You spend so much of your strength worrying about whether you deserve the family gathering around you. You have never once stopped to consider that we have each, in our own ways, been waiting for the day you would simply let yourself believe you do. The coin moved lazily beneath the surface of the pond, gold and white and orange catching the afternoon light, and somewhere beyond the garden wall Issei could hear the distant sound of the district market, voices calling out over the rustle of wind through maple leaves. It was such an ordinary, peaceful sound to carry a conversation this large. "I'm going to do this properly," Issei said. "Not drift into it. I want to ask everyone formally, the way Surzex meant. I want to build something real, something with a name and a shape, not just let it happen because none of us said no." Yasaka's smile deepened, ancient and warm and entirely certain. "Then you already have my answer, fox or devil's law notwithstanding. I have had it ready for quite some time. I was simply waiting, as I said, for you to be ready to ask." He found Kuno later that afternoon in the practice yard behind the main residence, swinging a wooden training blade with the fierce concentration of a child who took her future responsibilities with complete seriousness even while dressed in a bright orange training kimono 2 sizes too large for her. Issei. She abandoned the blade entirely the moment she spotted him, sprinting across the yard and barreling into him with the kind of unguarded affection that always caught somewhere behind his ribs. He had been present for so much of her childhood now, had bandaged her scraped knees and listened to her practice her formal speeches for clan gatherings and once, memorably, spent an entire night awake beside her bed after a nightmare about the Cows Brigade attack that had nearly taken her mother from her. "Mother said you were here? Did you finally come to ask?" Issei blinked. "Ask what?" Kuno gave him a look of such withering, premature exasperation that he nearly laughed. "Everyone in the district knows, Issei. You are hopeless at hiding things. Did you finally come to ask if you can marry Mother properly, the way the old stories say, with the binding ceremony and the formal adoption papers and everything?" Issei felt heat rise in his face, entirely unprepared for an 8-year-old fox spirit to corner him this directly. "I came to talk to her about something like that, yeah? It's a little more complicated than just—" "It is not complicated at all," Kuno announced with the supreme confidence of a child who had clearly given this matter extensive thought. "You fight for us. You remember my birthday every year even when you are busy saving the world. You taught me how to throw a punch properly instead of just clawing like Mother wanted me to learn first. You are already my family. The paperwork is simply slow because adults insist on making everything take longer than it needs to." "That's a very reasonable point," Issei admitted, crouching down to her eye level, and something in his chest ached in the good way, the way that reminded him exactly why he was doing all of this, why the weight of Surzex's question had transformed so quickly from fear into resolve. "I promise you, Kuno. I'm not going to let this take any longer than it has to. I'm going to do it right, but I'm not going to be slow about it either." Kuno studied him with eyes so much like her mother's, ancient knowing wrapped inside a child's face. "Good," she said finally, satisfied. "Because I have already decided what I am calling you once it is official, and I refuse to wait another whole year to use it." "Oh? And what's that?" Her grin turned bright, and entirely too pleased with itself. "Ota-san. Father. I have been practicing saying it properly for months." Issei did not trust himself to speak for a moment. He simply reached out and pulled her into a hug instead, and Kuno, for all her premature dignity, hugged him back without hesitation, fierce and small and entirely certain of the family she had already claimed as her own long before any formal ceremony made it official in the eyes of devils or foxes or anyone else's ancient laws. Above them, the maple leaves continued their slow gold drift toward the koi pond, and somewhere in the residence Yasaka watched her daughter and the man she had chosen with an expression of such quiet, complete contentment that even the oldest spirits of the district paused, briefly, to notice the particular warmth settling over the garden that afternoon. Chapter 3. The underworld smelled different from the human world, a fact Issei had never quite gotten used to even after years of visiting. Something metallic and ozone-sharp beneath the perfume of eternal twilight gardens, the scent of a realm where the sky itself was a construction rather than a given. He materialized at the edge of the Carmilla faction's territory just past what passed for evening there, and found the air immediately cooler, sharper, carrying the particular bite that always seemed to follow vampire nobility wherever they made their homes. Vanalene's estate rose ahead of him in tiers of blackstone and pale climbing roses, elegant in a way that managed to be both severe and achingly beautiful at once, much like the woman who ruled it. He had visited enough times now that the gates opened for him without challenge, the household staff offering small bows of recognition rather than the wary scrutiny that had greeted him on his very first visit years ago, back when the vampire duchess had still been testing whether the boy who fought beside Gaspar Vladi was worth her attention or merely another devil chasing curiosities. He found her in the high library, exactly where he expected, surrounded by towers of books and languages that had died out before most modern nations existed. She did not look up immediately when he entered, though the faint, knowing curve of her mouth told him she had heard him the moment he crossed into the estate's grounds. Sirzex Lucifer has been remarkably busy this week, she said, finally setting down the ancient text she had been studying and turning to face him fully. Vanalene was striking in the particular way that vampire nobility tended to be, pale and ageless and carrying herself with a stillness that suggested centuries of practiced control, but her violet eyes, when they settled on Issei, held none of the cold distance that had once defined her. I assume he has come to see you as well, given the look you are currently failing to hide. You knew he'd talk to me. I knew he would have to eventually. The underworld's nobility does not easily ignore a devil whose power and influence have outgrown the boundaries everyone assumed would contain him. She rose from her chair, the motion fluid and unhurried, and crossed the library to stand before him. Despite the centuries that separated their ages, despite the immense and dangerous power she commanded as one of the oldest vampire nobles still active in the underworld's politics, there was something almost shy in the way she reached for his hand, a vulnerability she allowed almost no one else to see. He asked me directly, Issei, whether I intended to remain merely an ally to your circle, or whether I intended to claim a permanent place within whatever house you eventually build. What did you tell him? Vanalene's violet eyes held his, steady and unflinching, though Issei could feel the faint tremor in her fingers where they laced with his own. For all her centuries of composure, this clearly was not easy for her to say aloud, and that vulnerability meant more to him than any amount of practiced eloquence could have. I told him the truth, she said. That I have spent the greater part of my long existence being treated as something to be feared, used as a political weapon by my own family, or courted only for the bloodline advantages a union with vampire nobility might provide. I have been proposed to 4 times in the past century alone, Issei, by devils and vampires both, and in every single instance the negotiations concerned territory, breeding rights, and political leverage before they ever once concerned me. Her grip on his hand tightened, not from anger but from something rawer. You are the only person who has ever sat across from me and asked what I wanted. Not what the Carmilla faction wanted, not what would benefit the balance of power between vampires and devils, but what Vanalene herself wanted, as though that question alone had value. A faint, almost disbelieving laugh escaped her. Do you understand how disorienting that was, the first time you asked it? I did not have an answer ready. Nobody had ever required me to have one. Issei remembered that conversation clearly, 2 years past now, in the immediate aftermath of the conflict that had nearly torn the Carmilla faction apart from the inside. He had found her alone in the ruins of a destroyed wing of this very estate, surrounded by the wreckage of a political marriage scheme that had cost her dearly, and he had simply asked, with no agenda beyond genuine concern, what she wanted to do next. Not what the situation required of her. What she wanted. You said you didn't know, Issei said softly. And then you asked me to stay until you figured it out. And you did, Vanalene said. You stayed for 3 days, Issei, doing nothing more than sitting with me through the worst grief of my recent centuries, asking nothing in return, expecting nothing in return. By the time you finally had to leave, I understood for the first time in longer than I cared to admit precisely what I wanted. Her free hand rose to rest lightly against his chest, over the steady beat of his heart, and her violet eyes shone with an intensity that made the air between them feel suddenly very thin. I wanted this. I wanted you. Not as a political alliance dressed up as romance, not as a bloodline arrangement disguised with pleasant words, but as something real, chosen freely, by both of us. Then choose it with me properly, Issei said, his own voice rough with the weight of everything he had been carrying since Serzex's visit. I'm done letting this stay undefined because defining it feels too big. I want to ask you formally, The same way I'm going to ask Rias and Akeno and Yasaka. I want to build a house, Vanalene, a real one, with all of you standing in it on purpose. For a long moment, Vanalene simply looked at him, something fragile and hopeful moving behind her ancient violet eyes, an expression so unguarded it transformed her entire bearing from regal stillness into something achingly human despite everything she was. You understand what you are proposing, she said quietly. A vampire noble, formerly bound into a devil's house, alongside a Gremory, a fallen angel's daughter, and the ruling kitsune of Kyoto. The old families will not simply accept this without resistance. There are factions within the underworld who still view vampires as little better than weapons to be leashed, foxes as foreign curiosities, and fallen blood as a stain to be managed rather than embraced. You will face opposition, Issei. Real opposition, from people with genuine power to make your life difficult. I know. And still you would choose this. I'd choose it twice as hard knowing it'll be difficult, Issei said, and meant every word of it. Because the alternative is letting people who have never once bothered to actually look at any of you decide what my family is allowed to look like. I'm not doing that. Not to you, not to any of them. Something in Vanalene's expression broke open then, centuries of careful composure giving way all at once to something raw and real. She stepped closer, resting her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and for a moment the ancient vampire duchess of the Carmilla faction simply allowed herself to be held, vulnerable and unguarded, by the one person who had ever made that vulnerability feel safe rather than exploitable. Then yes, she murmured against him. My answer has always been yes, Issei. I was only ever waiting for you to ask it the way you just did. Properly. Like it mattered. Like I mattered beyond what use I might be to anyone's ambitions. Outside the library's tall windows, the underworld's manufactured twilight deepened toward its long artificial night, pale roses glowing faintly silver in the dim light, and somewhere in the distance the faint sound of the estate's evening bells began to toll, marking an hour that meant nothing in a realm without a true sun, but which felt, in that particular moment, like the closing of one chapter and the quiet, certain opening of another. He did not return to the human world immediately. Vanalene insisted, with the particular gentle stubbornness she reserved for matters she considered important, that he stay for what she called proper tea, which in practice meant several hours spent in comfortable conversation, while the estate's ancient retainers fussed quietly in the background, clearly delighted by a development they had apparently been anticipating for some time. It was well past the underworld's deep artificial night when Issei finally took his leave, Vanalene walking him to the estate's outer gates with her hands still loosely laced through his own. There is something you should know, she said as they reached the gate, her tone shifting subtly into something more careful, more political. Before you go further with this, Lady Camilla LeBlanc of the Old Vampire Council has already begun making inquiries about your intentions. She does not approve of vampire nobility entangling themselves with reincarnated devils, regardless of rank or accomplishment. She considers it beneath the dignity of pure blood lines. Issei's jaw tightened slightly. Is she going to be a problem? She has been a problem for longer than your entire species has existed as a separate concept from the rest of the natural world, Vanalene said dryly. But do not let that concern you tonight. Tonight, I would simply like to remember the way you looked at me when you asked, before the politics inevitably arrived to complicate things. Issei softened, reaching up to brush a strand of pale hair back from her face, the gesture tender in the dim silver light of the gate lanterns. We'll deal with Camilla LeBlanc and anyone else who wants to make this difficult, he said. Together. That's the whole point of building something real, isn't it? Facing the hard parts together instead of letting any one of us carry it alone. Vanalene's smile, when it came, held none of the careful political distance she showed the rest of the underworld's nobility. It was simply warm, simply real, the smile of a woman who had finally, after centuries of being treated as a piece on someone else's board, found a place where she was allowed to simply be chosen. Together then, she agreed, and let him go with a final, lingering press of her hand against his, already certain that whatever opposition the old families intended to raise against this house Issei meant to build, it would find in her an ally far more formidable than they likely anticipated. Chapter 4. The full council chamber of the Gremory estate had not been used for a gathering this size in years. not since the days when Rias's parents had hosted formal negotiations between the great devil houses. Tonight it was filled not with diplomats and rival clan heads, but with the people Issei had spent the past week quietly speaking to, one by one, until the scattered threads of conversation had finally gathered themselves into something that needed to be said all together, in one room, where nobody could later claim they had not understood exactly what was being proposed. Rias sat at the head of the long table, composed and steady in the manner of someone born to lead difficult conversations, though Issei could see the faint nervous energy in the way her fingers occasionally tapped against the polished wood. Akeno sat close beside her, radiating her usual calm amusement even now, though her eyes kept finding Issei's with quiet reassurance. Yasaka had come from Kyoto for the occasion, Nine Tails settled elegantly behind her chair, and beside her, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the formality of the proceedings, Akeno had insisted on attending despite being told twice that this was a meeting for adults. Vanalene sat near the far end of the table, pale and composed, though the careful way she held herself suggested she understood better than anyone present exactly how much was riding on tonight going well. And beside Issei, looking faintly out of place in the grandeur of the Gremory Council chamber, sat the people who had practically raised him without ever asking for anything in return. His mother and father. "I still don't fully understand why we needed to be here for this," his father muttered, tugging uncomfortably at the collar of the formal jacket Rias's household staff had insisted he wear. "Couldn't you have just told us at home, son? Did we really need the whole council chamber experience?" "Dear, hush," his mother said, though she looked just as overwhelmed, glancing around the chamber's vaulted ceilings and ancient tapestries with wide, slightly panicked eyes. "I think our Issei is about to tell us something very important, and I think it deserves a proper room." Surzex Lucifer himself stood near the chamber's tall windows, having traveled from the underworld's capital specifically for this gathering, his expression carrying none of his usual easy humor tonight. Beside him stood a woman Issei did not recognize, elegant and severe, her pale hair drawn back in a style that belonged to another century entirely, her eyes carrying the particular cold assessment of someone who had already decided what conclusion she intended to reach. "Lady Camilla LeBlanc," Vanalene murmured to Issei, low enough that only he could hear, confirming what he had already half guessed. "Of the old Vampire Council. I did not expect her to arrive uninvited." "She was not, strictly speaking, uninvited," Surzex said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber despite its quiet pitch, a small acknowledgement that devil hearing made privacy a relative concept in rooms like this. "When matters concerning vampire nobility and underworld succession arise together, formal procedure requires the old council be granted observation rights. I extended the courtesy myself, Issei, though I assure you it was not done to undermine you." Lady Camilla's thin smile suggested otherwise, though she said nothing, merely settling into a chair near the chamber's edge with the patient stillness of someone content to wait for an opportunity to strike. Issei felt his pulse quicken, the weight of the room pressing down on him in a way that no battlefield ever quite managed. But when he glanced around the table, at Rias's steady crimson eyes, at Akeno's quiet confidence, at Yasaka's ancient patience, at Vanalene's careful hope, at his parents' bewildered but unwavering support, the nervousness settled into something steadier. He had not come here unprepared. He had come here certain. "Thank you all for coming," he began, rising from his seat. "I know this is unusual. I know some of you," his gaze flicked briefly to Lady Camilla, "did not expect to be part of this conversation at all. But I think it's important that everyone who matters, and everyone who might try to interfere, hears this from me directly, rather than through rumor or second-hand report." He took a steadying breath. "A few weeks ago, Surzex-sama asked me a question that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. He asked what kind of house I intend to build. Not as anyone's pawn, not as an extension of someone else's clan or someone else's legacy. As myself." Issei's eyes moved around the table, settling for a moment on each of the four women who had, in their own ways, shaped the entirety of who he had become. "I've spent the last week answering that question properly, in person, with each of you. I want to say it here too, all together, so there's no confusion and no room for anyone to pretend they misunderstood my intentions." He turned first to Rias. "Rias, You stood beside me from the very first day I became a devil, when I was nothing more than an untrained pawn with more enthusiasm than sense. You never once asked me to be smaller than I was, even when being who I was caused you trouble. You taught me what it means to lead with both strength and compassion, and you have never, not once, made me feel like the family I want to build is anything less than worthy of your house's legacy. Rias's composed expression cracked, just slightly, crimson eyes bright with emotion she was clearly fighting to keep contained in front of the assembled room. He turned next to Akeno. Akeno. You showed me that the parts of ourselves we're taught to be ashamed of, the parts that feel monstrous or contradictory or too complicated to belong anywhere, are not flaws to be hidden. They're simply parts of who we are, and the people who matter will love every piece of it without asking us to perform something smaller and safer. His voice softened. You taught me that, and then you let me try to teach it back to you, every single day since. Akeno's hand found the table's edge, steadying herself, her usual playful composure entirely gone now, replaced with something far more vulnerable and far more real. To Yasaka, he said, you showed me what it means to protect a family across centuries, to carry the weight of an entire people and still have room left over to love fiercely and without reservation. You let me become part of Kuna's life, part of your district, part of a legacy 1,000 years older than I am, and you never once made me feel like an outsider intruding on something I hadn't earned. Yasaka's amber eyes shone, and beside her, Kuna reached over to grip her mother's hand tightly, watching Issei with an expression of fierce, unwavering pride. And finally, to Vanalene. You showed me what it costs to finally be chosen for yourself, after a lifetime of being treated as something to be used. And you taught me that choosing someone properly means asking what they want, every time, and never assuming the answer is owed to you simply because you want it to be. Vanalene's violet eyes glistened, her careful composure finally, fully giving way. Issei turned to face the whole chamber now, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to say. I want to build a house with all four of you. Properly, formally, with all the old laws and ceremonies that make it real and lasting, not something half-spoken and left undefined because it felt too large to name. I know that's unconventional. I know some people in this room, again, his gaze flicked toward Lady Camilla, who watched him now with cold, calculating attention, are going to have objections rooted in tradition, in bloodline politics, in centuries of precedent about what a proper devil house is supposed to look like. He met Lady Camilla's gaze directly, refusing to look away. But I'm not interested in building a house that fits neatly inside someone else's old definitions. I'm interested in building one with the people who actually chose to stay, again and again, through every difficult thing this world has thrown at us. And I don't think any tradition, however old, gets to tell any of us that the family we've already built and everything but name isn't worth making official. The chamber fell into a silence so complete that even the ancient tapestries seemed to hold their breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, Lady Camilla LeBlanc rose from her chair, her expression unreadable, and the room's attention turned to her with the particular tension of people waiting to see exactly how much trouble had just walked through the door. A bold speech, she said, her voice carrying the cool, measured precision of someone who had survived centuries of political maneuvering through careful words rather than open conflict. And an interesting position to take, Issei Hyoudou, given that you have not yet considered what the old Vampire Council, and several similarly minded factions among the underworld's noble houses, intend to do about it. Vanalene rose as well, standing protectively beside Issei despite the chamber's formal expectations of stillness. The Camilla faction's internal affairs are not subject to the old council's approval, Lady Camilla. You know this. Your personal choices, perhaps not, Camilla agreed smoothly. But a formal alliance binding vampire nobility, Gremory succession, the Himejima fallen line, and the ruling house of Kyoto's Yukai together under a single reincarnated devil's banner is no longer merely a personal matter, my dear. It is a political event of significant magnitude, one several powerful factions will have very strong opinions about. Her cold eyes settled on Issei with something that might, in a kinderwoman, have resembled curiosity. I have not yet decided whether I intend to oppose this, Mr. Hyoudou. But I assure you, before any of you complete whatever ceremonies you have planned, you will need to satisfy considerably more than a heartfelt speech in a private chamber. The old laws governing interspecies union among the great houses are extensive, and not easily set aside simply because 4 powerful women happen to find you compelling. She inclined her head slightly, an almost mocking gesture of respect, and turned to leave the chamber, pausing only briefly at the door. Consider this your formal notice. The old council will be watching closely, and I suspect we will not be the only ones. The doors closed behind her with a soft, final click, and for a long moment nobody in the chamber spoke at all. Chapter 5. It was Issei's mother who broke the silence first, and not, as everyone might have expected, with worry. Well, she said, setting down the teacup she had been nervously clutching since the meeting began, I have to say, that was considerably more dramatic than I expected when your father and I got dressed this morning. A surprised laugh broke loose from Akeno, the sound cutting cleanly through the chamber's lingering tension, and slowly, one by one, the rest of the room followed, the terrible weight of Lady Camilla's exit easing just slightly under the absurdity of his mother's perfectly timed understatement. Mom, Issei said, equal parts mortified and grateful, that's not exactly. I'm serious, dear. She rose from her seat and crossed the chamber to where he stood, reaching up to fix the collar of his jacket with the same brisk, practical affection she had shown him his entire life. Whether he was 8 years old and scraped from falling off his bike or 18 and standing in a council chamber having just declared his intention to formally unite 4 supernatural houses. I don't fully understand the politics of all this, and frankly some of it sounds rather frightening. But I understood every word you said about each of them, and I want you to know your father and I are very, very proud of the man you've become. Issei's father, still tugging uncomfortably at his collar, nodded with the slightly overwhelmed but entirely sincere expression of a man who had spent years quietly adjusting to the fact that his son's life involved considerably more devils, dragons, and ancient politics than any parenting book had prepared him for. Your mother's right, he said. I won't pretend I understand half of what just happened with that vampire lady. But I've watched you grow up, son, and I've watched these 4 young women, he gestured, somewhat helplessly, around the table, be there for you through things I can barely wrap my head around. If you've chosen them, and they've chosen you back, properly, the way you said, then you have our blessing. For whatever that's worth in underworld politics. It's worth everything, Rias said softly, rising to approach Issei's parents with the warm, genuine respect she had always shown them, ever since the earliest days of carefully concealing devil business behind increasingly implausible excuses. Mr. and Mrs. Hyoudou, I promise you, whatever the old council decides to throw at us, your blessing matters more to Issei than any of it. Yasaka inclined her head in agreement, ancient and gracious. In my culture, the approval of a partner's parents carries weight that even the oldest political councils cannot easily override. You have given your son something tonight that strengthens our position considerably, whether you intended the political dimension or not. We mostly intended the parental pride dimension, Issei's mother admitted, smiling, but I'm glad it's useful. Kunu, who had been watching the entire proceeding with the keen attention of a child absorbing every detail for later analysis, tugged at her mother's sleeve. Does this mean the scary vampire council lady is going to try to stop the wedding? There hasn't been a wedding announced yet, Kunu, Yasaka said gently, though her amber eyes flicked toward Issei with unmistakable amusement. There will be, Kunu said, with the absolute, unshakable confidence only an 8-year-old fox spirit could muster. And when there is, I am going to be the one carrying mother's tales down the aisle, and nobody's old council is going to stop me. The image was so unexpectedly endearing that even Vanalene, still visibly shaken from the confrontation with her own faction's elder council, found herself smiling, the tension in her shoulders easing fractionally. Serzex, who had remained quiet near the windows throughout the family moment unfolding before him, finally stepped forward, his expression serious but not unkind. I want to be direct with all of you, he said. Lady Camilla LeBlanc does not make idle threats. The old vampire council carries real influence, and there are factions among the 72 pillars who will be sympathetic to her objections, particularly those who have long resented how quickly Issei's influence has grown relative to his bloodline standing. How much trouble are we actually looking at? Issei asked, the lighter mood of moments ago giving way to the practical weight of what lay ahead. Significant trouble, if handled poorly, Serzex said honestly. There are old laws, rarely invoked in recent centuries, governing formal unions between devil houses and other supernatural factions. Laws originally written to prevent exactly the kind of concentrated power a union like the one you are proposing would create. Satisfying those laws will require more than personal conviction, however genuine. It will require political groundwork, formal petitions, likely a hearing before the full Council of 72 Pillars, and quite possibly individual negotiations with the Yukai Elder Council and the Gremory regarding Akeno's fallen lineage. That sounds like months of work, Rias said, frowning slightly as she ran through the implications. Possibly longer, Surzex agreed. But I did not come here tonight merely to deliver bad news. A faint, familiar warmth returned to his expression, the easy confidence that had made him beloved across the underworld despite his immense power. I came to tell you that I intend to support this union personally, and formally, as Lucifer. My endorsement alone will not silence every objection, but it will ensure you have a fair hearing rather than a hostile one. The rest, however, will fall to all of you. You will need to prove, individually and together, that this house deserves to exist on its own merits, not merely on the strength of my approval. Issei felt the weight of what lay ahead settle over him, real and substantial, but beneath it, something steadier than fear had already taken root. He looked around the chamber once more, at Rias's determined resolve, at Akeno's quiet strength, at Yasaka's ancient patience, at Vanalene's fragile but unmistakable hope, at his parents' unwavering support, at Kuna's fierce, uncomplicated certainty. Then we'll do the work, Issei said simply. However long it takes, whatever hearings or petitions or negotiations it requires. I didn't ask any of you to choose this because it would be easy. I asked because it's worth doing properly, even if that means fighting for it. Akeno moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with the same easy certainty it always did. We have faced worse odds than a council of disapproving elders, Issei. I rather think we will manage. Considerably worse odds, Rias agreed, taking his other hand, crimson eyes bright with the particular fire she carried into every fight worth having. And we have never lost one yet, not when it actually mattered. Vanalene crossed the chamber to join them, her earlier fragility settling into something more resolute, centuries of careful political instinct already turning toward the practical question of how best to counter Lady Camilla's coming maneuvers. I know the old council's weaknesses better than most. If they intend to make this difficult, I intend to make it considerably more difficult for them in return. Yasaka rose as well, nine tails settling with quiet, ancient dignity behind her. And Kyoto's Yukai Elder Council will find, should they raise any objection, that I have weathered considerably more dangerous opposition than a gathering of cautious traditionalists. I did not survive 1,000 years of history by backing away from a fight worth having. Surzex watched the five of them gather together, something like genuine satisfaction settling over his expression, and beside him, Issei's parents exchanged a glance that carried equal parts pride and bewildered amazement at the scale of the world their son had grown into. Then I suggest, Surzex said, we begin preparing properly. The road ahead will not be simple. But I have rarely seen a house enter a political fight with this much genuine conviction behind it, and conviction, in my experience, tends to matter rather more than the old families like to admit. Outside the chamber's tall windows, the manufactured twilight of the underworld sky had deepened toward its long artificial night, and within the warm lamplight of the Gremory Council chamber, five people who had chosen each other freely, deliberately, and with open eyes began, together, the long work of making that choice impossible for anyone to take from them. The fight had only just begun. But for the first time since Surzex had first asked his impossible question, Issei found that he was not afraid of it at all. Chapter 6. The war room beneath the Gremory estate had not been called a war room in over a century, not since Rias's grandfather had used it to coordinate the family's position during the last great Devil Civil War. Dust had been cleared from its long obsidian table only days earlier, and now it was covered instead with maps of underworld political territory, genealogical charts of the 72 pillars, and a steadily growing stack of legal precedent that Graphia had personally retrieved from the Gremory archives. The relevant statute, Graphia said, setting down the final volume with the crisp precision she brought to everything, is the Concordat of Mixed Houses, established roughly 600 years ago in the aftermath of the old Satan faction's first attempt to seize power through manufactured alliances between devil clans and outside factions. It was written specifically to prevent exactly the kind of rapid, concentrated power growth that a union like yours represents, Issei. Whether the original drafters intended it as a genuine safeguard or merely as a tool for established houses to suppress rising ones is a matter of some historical debate. Issei rubbed his temples, staring at the dense legal text without fully absorbing it. 3 days of meetings with Surzex's diplomatic staff had taught him more about devil constitutional law than he had ever wanted to know, and they were, by every account, only beginning. In plain terms, Rias said, taking pity on him, the Concordat requires that any formal union joining a devil house with 3 or more outside supernatural factions must pass 3 separate hurdles before the 72 pillars will even schedule a ratification hearing. First, formal endorsement from the head of each outside faction involved, confirming the union is entered freely and without coercion. Second, a demonstrated period of cohabitation and mutual support, proving the bond is genuine rather than a hastily constructed political arrangement. Third, and most difficult, a public hearing before a quorum of pillar heads, where any house may raise formal objection. We already have the first part covered, mostly, Akeno pointed out, counting on her fingers. Yasaka-san is the head of her own faction. Vanalene answers to the Carmilla matriarch, but she holds enough seniority within the faction that her own endorsement likely satisfies the requirement. Rias is, well, Rias, so the Gremory side is uncontested. She paused. I am the complication. The room quieted slightly. Issei looked at her, and Akeno met his gaze with her usual composed warmth, though there was something more guarded underneath it tonight. The Gregory, Graphia confirmed. As a being of mixed fallen angel and shrine maiden lineage, your formal endorsement for a union of this kind technically requires sign-off from the Gregory's governing council, given your father's standing within their ranks. It is an old technicality, rarely invoked, but Lady Camilla LeBlanc strikes me as exactly the sort of opponent who would search out every old technicality available to her. Akeno's expression flickered, just briefly, something complicated passing behind her dark eyes. Issei reached over without thinking and took her hand beneath the table, and she squeezed back gratefully, though the tension in her shoulders did not fully ease. My father and I have not spoken in months, Akeno admitted quietly. Not since the reconciliation after the Cow's Brigade War settled into something more like polite distance than genuine relationship. I do not know how he will respond to a formal request like this. Then we'll go ask him together, Issei said immediately. Not send a formal petition through some bureaucratic channel. Actually go, in person, and ask. Issei, the Gregory's governing council does not typically receive visitors based on personal appeals. I don't care what they typically do, Issei said, and there was a quiet firmness in his voice that made even Graphia glance up from her notes. If Barakiel's endorsement is part of what we need, then I want to earn it properly, not have it granted through some legal formality he never actually weighed in on personally. He's your father, Akeno. He should hear this from both of us, not from a stack of paperwork. Akeno was quiet for a long moment, something soft and uncertain moving across her face, the careful composure she wore like armor slipping just slightly to reveal the part of her that still, after everything, carried old wounds about her relationship with her father. All right, she said finally. Together then? Yasaka, who had been listening from across the table with characteristic patience, spoke next. The Yukai Elder Council will require similar care, though for different reasons. They are not opposed to outside unions on principle. We have intermarried with devils, humans, and other Yukai clans for centuries when the bond was genuine. But they will want to see, clearly and unambiguously, that this union strengthens rather than dilutes Kyoto's standing among the great factions. Kunu's position as heir will need to be formally addressed as well, given that any children born of additional unions could complicate succession. Kunu already considers herself part of this, Issei said. She told me herself, weeks ago. I'm not going to let any council decide her place in this family is anything other than exactly what she's already claimed. Yasaka's mouth curved into a small, proud smile. Good. Because I intend to make precisely that argument before the Elder Council, and I suspect it will land considerably better coming with that conviction behind it. Vanalene, who had remained quiet throughout most of the strategic discussion, finally spoke, her violet eyes thoughtful. Lady Camilla will not limit herself to procedural obstacles. She is too patient and too experienced a political operator to rely solely on the Concordat's technical requirements. She will be working to turn individual pillarheads against this union before the hearing ever takes place, building a coalition of opposition quietly, so that by the time we stand before the quorum, the outcome already feels predetermined. Can we do anything about that? Issei asked. We can do the same thing, in reverse, Vanalene said. Build our own quiet support before the hearing, so that when Lady Camilla makes her move, she discovers the ground has already shifted beneath her. A faint, sharp smile crossed her pale features, the look of a woman who had survived centuries of underworld politics and had no intention of losing this particular fight. I know which pillarheads owe the Carmilla faction favors. I know which ones harbor old resentments against the old vampire council's overreach. This is not my first political war, Issei. I do not intend to fight it carelessly. Surzex, who had been observing the strategic session from a chair near the room's edge, finally spoke. I will not involve myself directly in courting individual pillarheads, as my position as Lucifer requires a degree of neutrality in matters before the quorum. But I can ensure the hearing itself is scheduled fairly, and conducted according to proper procedure rather than whatever maneuvering Lady Camilla might prefer. Beyond that, the work is yours to do. That's enough, Issei said. We don't need you to fight this for us. We just need a fair shot at fighting it ourselves. Surzex's smile, when it came, held genuine warmth. Then let us begin. Grafia will provide each of you with a full list of procedural requirements specific to your individual factions. I suggest dividing the work according to where each of you holds the most natural influence, and reconvening here in 1 week to assess progress. The room settled into the particular focused energy of people preparing for a genuine fight, papers shuffling, voices rising into overlapping discussion of strategy and timeline, and in the middle of it all, Issei found himself struck by how natural it felt. Not like a political campaign undertaken reluctantly, but like a family preparing to defend something they had already, quietly, decided was worth defending with everything they had. Later that night, after the others had departed to begin their own threads of the work ahead, Issei found Akeno alone on the estate's east balcony, looking out over the manufactured twilight sky with an expression more contemplative than he had seen from her in some time. Thinking about your father? He asked, joining her at the railing. Thinking about how strange it is, she said, that the hardest part of all this political maneuvering, for me, has nothing to do with ancient laws or hostile council members. It is simply the prospect of standing in front of my father again, and asking him to formally acknowledge something I want. A faint, self-deprecating smile touched her mouth. I spent so many years certain he did not want me at all. Now I am asking him to publicly endorse the family I am building, and some old, frightened part of me still expects rejection. Issei wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without hesitation, the motion familiar and easy after years of exactly this kind of quiet comfort passing between them. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think he's going to reject this. I think he's going to be terrified for an entirely different reason. Watching his daughter walk into a room fully sure of who she is and what she wants, after everything that happened between you. That's not a small thing for a father to witness, Akeno. I think it might actually undo him a little. Akeno was quiet for a moment, turning the thought over. You really believe that? I really do. I've watched you become exactly that person this whole past week. Sure of yourself. Not performing strength, just having it. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. Whatever happens with the council technicalities, that part isn't going to change. You don't need his endorsement to be exactly who you already are. We're just going to go ask him, together, because it matters to you, and because I want him to see what I see. Akeno turned in his arms, looking up at him with an expression that held none of her usual teasing distance, only quiet, unguarded gratitude. How did I get so fortunate, she murmured, to find someone who makes even the frightening parts of this feel survivable? Pretty sure that's supposed to be my line, Issei said, and she laughed softly, the sound easing some of the tension that had gathered in her shoulders since the meeting below. They stood together at the railing a while longer, the underworld's artificial stars settling into their long night cycle above them, and somewhere beneath the quiet, both of them carried the same steady certainty. Whatever waited ahead, in council chambers and pillar hearings and difficult conversations with estranged fathers, they would face it the same way they had faced everything else. Together, and without flinching from any part of what that required. Chapter 7. The Gregory's central tower rose out of a perpetual bank of high clouds, its architecture a strange and beautiful fusion of cathedral spires and something more elemental, as though the building itself had been grown from lightning rather than built from stone. Issei had visited the fallen angel's headquarters only twice before, both times during diplomatic missions alongside Azazel, and both times he had come away faintly unsettled by how thoroughly the place seemed to hum with restrained power. Akeno walked beside him in silence as they ascended the long spiral stair toward the council level, her expression carefully composed, though Issei could feel the faint tension radiating from her, visible only in the slightly too rigid set of her shoulders. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, as they reached the final landing before the council chamber doors. "We can find another way to satisfy the Concordat's requirements. There might be precedent for an alternate endorsement, someone else within the Gregory hierarchy." "No," Akeno said, firm despite the tension still visible in her posture. "If I am building this family properly, the way you said, then I want to do it without leaving an old wound conveniently unaddressed because confronting it is uncomfortable. I have spent enough of my life avoiding this conversation. I am done avoiding it." The chamber doors opened before either of them could knock, revealing not the full Gregory governing council Issei had expected, but a single figure standing near the chamber's tall windows, dark wings folded loosely behind him, expression unreadable in the way that had always made Barakil difficult for Issei to read clearly. "I asked the rest of the council to grant us privacy," Barakil said, his voice carrying the same low, measured quality Issei remembered from their previous encounters. This conversation did not seem like one that should happen in front of an audience. Akeno's breath caught faintly, surprise flickering across her face before she carefully smoothed it away. "You knew we were coming," Azazel mentioned it. "He finds very little joy in keeping secrets from me when the secret in question involves my daughter." A faint, almost rueful smile touched Barakil's mouth, there and gone quickly. "Please. Sit if you would prefer. This need not be a formal proceeding." They settled into the chairs arranged near the windows, the silence stretching uncomfortably for a long moment before Issei, sensing Akeno's hesitation, decided to simply begin. "Barakil-san," he said, "I'm here because the Concordat of Mixed Houses requires formal endorsement from the head of any outside faction involved in a union like the one I'm trying to build. Given Akeno's lineage, that technically means your endorsement, or the Gregory Council's, is required before our petition can proceed to a pillar hearing." "I am aware of the Concordat's requirements," Barakil said. "I have, in fact, already reviewed the relevant statute in some detail since Azazel's mention of your intentions reached me." His gaze shifted to Akeno, something complicated and careful in his expression. "But I suspect you did not come here merely to satisfy a legal technicality, Issei Hyoudou. I suspect, knowing what little I do of your character, that you came here because you wanted my daughter to have this conversation properly, regardless of what the law requires." "Yeah," Issei admitted. "I did." Barakil was quiet for a long moment, his attention settling fully on Akeno now, and something in his expression shifted, the careful political distance giving way to something rawer, more uncertain. "Akeno," he said, "I have rehearsed 100 different versions of what I might say to you, should this day ever arrive. None of them feel adequate now that it has." He drew a slow breath. "I know I failed you, in the years that mattered most. I know that knowing why I kept my distance, fear of Shemhazai's experiments, fear that closeness would only paint a larger target on your back, does not undo the damage of a childhood spent believing your own father considered you a stain rather than a daughter. I have spent years trying to find a way to make that right, and I am not certain I ever fully will." Akeno's composed expression finally cracked, something old and aching surfacing in her dark eyes. "Why are you telling me this now? I came here for a legal endorsement, not because watching you walk into this chamber," Barakil said, prepared to ask for something you wanted, fully and without apology, alongside a man who clearly cherishes every part of who you are, fallen blood and shrine maiden lineage both, undid something in me I did not expect. His voice roughened slightly. You do not need my endorsement to be worthy of the family you are building, Akeno. You have never needed anyone's permission for that. But I find that I want, very badly, to give it to you anyway. Not because the Concordat requires it. Because I am your father, and I am proud of who you have become despite every reason I gave you to become someone smaller and more bitter instead. The chamber fell into a silence different from before, heavier with the weight of years finally being acknowledged rather than carefully avoided. Akeno's eyes glistened, her usual composure entirely gone now, replaced with something raw and unguarded that Issei had rarely seen from her even in their most private moments. I spent so long, she said quietly, convinced that the part of me that came from you was something to apologize for. That my lightning, my wings, everything that marked me as your daughter, was a curse I had to overcome rather than something I was allowed to simply have. You were never a curse, Barraquil said, and his voice broke slightly on the words. You were the one unambiguous good thing that came from a relationship that brought your mother nothing but suffering in the end. I should have told you that every single day of your childhood instead of keeping my distance out of fear. I am sorry, Akeno. I am more sorry than I know how to properly express. Akeno rose from her chair, crossing the short distance between them, and for a long moment father and daughter simply stood together, the careful distance of years finally, imperfectly, beginning to close. Issei watched, throat tight, as Barraquil's wings shifted slightly. An old instinct toward protectiveness finally allowed expression after years of careful restraint, drawing forward just enough to settle lightly around his daughter's shoulders. I formally endorse this union, Barraquil said quietly, still holding his daughter close. Not because underworld law requires it of me, but because I have watched my daughter become someone fierce and whole and entirely her own person, and I trust her judgment about who deserves to stand beside her in that. He looked over Akeno's shoulder at Issei, something like genuine gratitude in his expression. Take care of her, Issei Hyoudou. Not because she needs protecting. Because she deserves to be cherished, fully, by someone who sees exactly what I failed to see clearly enough, soon enough. I will, Issei said, voice steady despite the emotion thick in the room. Every day, for as long as she'll have me. It was some time later, after the formal endorsement papers had been signed and witnessed, after father and daughter had spoken quietly for nearly an hour about years of distance neither had known quite how to bridge until now, that Issei and Akeno finally descended the Gremory Tower's long spiral stair together, the late afternoon light slanting gold through the high windows around them. Thank you, Akeno said softly, as they reached the tower's base, her hand finding his and lacing their fingers together with quiet certainty. For insisting we come here properly, instead of letting some legal technicality settle it from a distance. You did the hard part, Issei said. I just stood next to you while you did it. You stood next to me, Akeno agreed, the same way you have always stood next to me, through every hard thing this strange life has thrown at us. She leaned up, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek, warmth and gratitude radiating from her in a way that needed no further words to explain. I think, perhaps, that is simply what you do best, Issei. Standing beside people until they remember they are strong enough to face the things they have spent years avoiding. They walked out into the Gremory Tower's surrounding gardens together, the weight that had pressed on Akeno's shoulders for years finally, visibly lighter, and somewhere above them, watching from the tower's high windows, Barraquil allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, a genuine and uncomplicated smile. Chapter 8. The Yukai Elder Council convened in a hall Issei had never been permitted to enter in all his years of visiting Kyoto's hidden district, an ancient structure of dark cedar and woven bamboo screens that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it, lending the entire space a hushed, reverent quality that put him on edge despite himself. 7 elders sat arranged in a careful arc at the hall's far end, each representing a different branch of Yukai lineage that had pledged loyalty to Yasaka's rule over the centuries. Issei recognized none of them individually, though Yasaka had briefed him thoroughly on each elder's history, temperament, and likely concerns during the long journey from her residence to the council hall that morning. Elder His aim represents the river spirits, Yasaka had explained, walking beside him through the autumn gardens, Kunu trailing a short distance behind them in her best formal kimono, unusually solemn for the occasion. She is the most likely to raise procedural objections, though her concerns tend to be genuine rather than political. Elder Tanuki Genzo, despite the unfortunate literalism of his name, leads the Tanuki clans and has historically been our strongest ally on matters of outside alliance, having married a human himself 2 centuries ago. The others fall somewhere between, though I would watch Elder Karasa Tenma most carefully. He has old grievances against devil kind dating back to a conflict before either of us was born, and he does not easily set aside old grievances. Now, standing before the full council, Issei felt the weight of 7 sets of ancient, evaluating eyes settle on him, and understood immediately why Yasaka had taken such care preparing him for this moment. Yasaka-sama, Elder Hizame said, her voice carrying the particular quality of running water, smooth and persistent, you have called this council to consider a matter of significant weight. A formal union between yourself, as head of Kyoto's Yukai, and a reincarnated devil whose standing within his own people's hierarchy remains, by devil standards, still relatively new. Before we proceed, I believe the council would benefit from understanding precisely what this union offers our people, beyond whatever personal regard you hold for this young man. Yasaka inclined her head respectfully, though Issei caught the faint flash of protective irritation in her amber eyes at the dismissive framing. I will let Issei answer that question himself, Elder Hizame. I believe he is better positioned to explain his own intentions than I am to explain them on his behalf. All 7 elders turned their attention fully to Issei now, and he felt his pulse quicken, though he had spent the journey here rehearsing exactly this moment, knowing it would come. I'm not going to pretend I can offer Kyoto's Yukai some grand strategic advantage, Issei said, choosing his words carefully. I'm not a master tactician, and I'm not bringing armies or territory or ancient treasures to this union. What I can offer is what I've already been offering, quietly, for years now, whether your council formally acknowledged it or not. I've fought alongside Yasaka-san and Kunu during the worst crisis this district has faced in living memory. I've helped rebuild what the Cows Brigade destroyed. I've spent years learning Kyoto's customs, not because any treaty required it, but because I wanted to understand the people I was choosing to be part of. Elder Tanuki Genzo, the council member Yasaka had identified as the most likely ally, leaned forward slightly with evident interest. You speak of choosing rather than acquiring. That is, I will admit, a more thoughtful framing than this council typically hears from devil envoys. Because I'm not here as a devil envoy, Issei said. I'm here because I love Yasaka-san, and I love Kunu like she's already my own daughter, and I want that to be something real and formal, and protected by more than just personal feeling. I understand that means earning your trust properly, not assuming it's owed to me because of who I've reincarnated, as or what power I happen to carry. Elder Karasa Tenma, silent until now, finally spoke, his voice carrying old, sharp edges that immediately put the rest of the hall on alert. Pretty words. But I recall, young devil, the last time a powerful reincarnated devil sought close alliance with the Yukai faction. The old Satan remnants who tried to use exactly this kind of romantic entanglement as a means of slowly absorbing Yukai territory into devil jurisdiction, 3 centuries past. How am I to know your intentions differ meaningfully from theirs, beyond the sincerity of your speech? The hall's atmosphere shifted, tension rising visibly, and Issei felt the urge to respond defensively, to argue the comparison was unfair. Instead, he forced himself to consider the elder's concern seriously, recognizing the genuine wound beneath the accusation. That's a fair question, Issei said slowly. And I can't prove my intentions through words alone, not when there's real historical precedent for exactly the kind of betrayal you're describing. He paused, thinking carefully. So instead of asking you to simply trust my word, I'd like to propose something concrete. Whatever formal union results from this, I want Kyoto's Yukai district to retain full sovereign authority over its own territory and governance, with no devil jurisdiction extending into district affairs beyond what Yasaka-san herself chooses to permit. I'm not interested in absorbing anything. I'm interested in being part of a family that happens to include an entire people I've come to genuinely care about, while leaving their independence completely intact. Elder Karasu studied him for a long moment, old suspicion warring visibly with something more uncertain. You would commit to such terms formally? In writing, witnessed by this full council? Gladly, Issei said. I'll sign whatever protections this council wants written into the formal record. I'm not trying to win an argument here. I'm trying to prove, with something more solid than words, that I understand exactly what kind of trust I'm asking your people to extend. A long silence followed, the 7 elders exchanging glances that carried decades, in some cases centuries, of shared history and unspoken communication. Finally, Elder Hizame spoke again, her tone notably softer than before. Konu, she said, turning her attention to the young fox spirit who had remained quiet and solemn throughout the proceedings, you have remained silent this entire hearing, though I suspect you have opinions on this matter, given your evident closeness with the young man in question. The council would value your perspective, if you are willing to share it. Konu straightened, glancing briefly at her mother for reassurance before stepping forward with the careful formality she had clearly been practicing for weeks. Elder Hizame. Elders all. She bowed properly, the gesture precise despite her evident nerves. I know I am young, and I know my opinion carries less formal weight than a sitting council member's. But I have lived beside Issei for 2 years now, and I have watched him put himself between this district and danger more than once, expecting nothing in return for it. He taught me to throw a proper punch when half this council was still debating whether I was old enough to begin combat training. He sat with me through nightmares after the Cow's Brigade attack, when even Mother was occupied managing the crisis itself. He remembers my birthday. He remembers the small things, not just the large political ones. She looked directly at Elder Karasu now, her young voice steady despite the weight of his earlier suspicion. I cannot promise you he will never disappoint this council, Elder Karasu. Nobody can promise that of anyone. But I can promise you that I trust him completely, with my own safety and my mother's and this entire district's, and I do not offer that trust lightly, even at my age. The hall fell silent again, this time charged with something different, the weight of a child's unguarded sincerity landing in a way that careful adult diplomacy rarely managed. Elder Karasu's stern expression finally, fractionally softened. The heir's testimony, he said slowly, carries more weight with this council than perhaps either of you anticipated. He glanced around at his fellow elders, something unspoken passing between them. I withdraw my formal objection, pending the written protections discussed today being properly drafted and witnessed. I will not pretend my old grievances have vanished entirely. But I am willing to extend the trust this child describes, provisionally, and watch carefully whether it proves warranted. One by one, the remaining elders offered similar, if more measured, endorsements, until finally Elder Hizame rose to formally close the proceeding. This council grants its formal endorsement to the proposed union between Yasaka-sama and Issei Hyoudou, conditional upon the written sovereignty protections discussed today being properly executed and witnessed within 30 days. The concordat's requirement is satisfied. Relief swept through the hall, visible even in the careful, dignified bearing of Kyoto's eldest spirits, and Yasaka crossed immediately to where Issei stood, her amber eyes bright with pride and quiet, fierce affection. You handled that better than I dared hope, she murmured, low enough that only he could hear. I had a pretty incredible co-counsel, Issei said, glancing toward Konu, who was currently being congratulated by several elders for her composed testimony, practically glowing with pride despite her efforts to maintain a dignified bearing befitting her status as heir. She has wanted to make that speech for weeks, Yasaka admitted, smiling. I told her she would have her chance, when the moment was right. I am glad she trusted that timing as much as she trusts you. They watched together as Konu finally abandoned all pretense of formal dignity, dashing across the hall to throw her arms around Issei's waist, her earlier solemnity entirely forgotten in favor of unguarded, triumphant joy. I did good, right? She demanded. Elder Karasu actually listened to me. He never listens to anyone under 200 years old. You did incredible, Issei said, ruffling her hair affectionately, and Kuna's bright, satisfied grin told him more clearly than any council ratification ever could that this family, whatever ancient laws and careful negotiations it required to make official, had already, in every way that mattered, long since become real. Chapter 9. Vanalene had not visited the Carmilla matriarch's private chambers in nearly a decade, not since the political fallout of her own broken engagement had made such visits feel more like obligation than family. The matriarch's estate sat at the heart of vampire territory, its black stone towers older than most devil noble houses, carrying centuries of carefully guarded history within walls that had weathered every political storm the underworld had thrown at vampire kind since their faction's earliest founding. She had come alone today, deliberately. Some conversations required the absence of an audience, even one as supportive as Issei and the rest of the family gathering around him. Vanalene. The matriarch, Lucretia Carmilla, rose from her high-backed chair as her granddaughter entered, age sitting on her sharp features not as weakness but as accumulated authority, centuries of survival distilled into every careful movement. I confess I did not expect a visit, given how thoroughly you have been occupied with your devil's political troubles. They are not merely his troubles, grandmother. Vanalene settled into the chair across from the matriarch without waiting for invitation, a small assertion of equal standing that the old vampire noted with a faint, approving flicker of her pale eyes. They are mine as well, now. I came to discuss Lady Camilla LeBlanc's recent maneuvering, and to ask directly where this estate intends to stand when the matter comes before the pillar hearing. Lucretia was quiet for a long moment, studying her granddaughter with the particular intensity of someone who had outlived enough political upheavals to recognize genuine conviction when she saw it. You have changed these past months, she said finally. I remember a granddaughter who approached every conversation like this one armored against disappointment, certain that whatever she wanted would inevitably be denied her in favor of the faction's broader interests. I do not see that armor today. I do not need it today, Vanalene said simply. I know what I want, grandmother, and I am no longer willing to apologize for wanting it. A faint, genuine smile crossed Lucretia's ancient features, there and gone quickly, though it left something warmer behind it. Good. I confess I have waited a long time to see that particular certainty settle properly into you. She rose, crossing to the chamber's tall window, looking out over the dark spires of vampire territory with an expression Vanalene could not quite read. Lady Camilla LeBlanc has approached this estate twice in the past week, seeking my endorsement of her opposition. I have, on both occasions, declined to commit either way. Why? Because Camilla LeBlanc has spent the better part of 3 centuries positioning herself as the guardian of vampire purity and tradition, and in that time I have watched her destroy no fewer than 6 promising young vampires whose only crime was wanting something the old council found inconvenient. Lucretia's expression hardened slightly. I have my own complicated history with tradition, Vanalene. I built much of this estate's current standing by enforcing exactly the kind of careful bloodline politics Camilla now champions. I am not proud of every choice I made in service of that standing, including, I will admit freely, the engagement negotiations that caused you such pain a decade past. Vanalene's breath caught slightly, surprised by the admission. Her grandmother rarely acknowledged past mistakes so directly. I am telling you this, Lucretia continued, because I want you to understand precisely what kind of opposition you are facing, and precisely why I have not yet decided to formally support Camilla's position despite our shared history of valuing tradition. She turned back to face Vanalene fully. I am old, granddaughter. Old enough to have watched tradition calcify into something that protects nothing so much as the comfort of those already in power. I do not know yet whether your devil deserves the trust you have placed in him. But I have watched you, these past months, become someone more whole than I have seen you in decades, and that observation carries weight with me that Camilla's tired arguments about bloodline purity simply do not. Then you will endorse the union? I did not say that, Lucretia said, though something almost playful flickered behind her ancient eyes. I said I have not yet decided. I would like to meet him properly first, Vanalene. Not through council proceedings or formal negotiations. Simply meet him, and form my own judgment, the way I should have done with your previous suitors instead of allowing politics to make that judgment for me. Vanalene felt something loosen in her chest, relief and cautious hope tangled together. I can arrange that. Do, Lucretia said. And Vanalene. She paused, something gentler entering her weathered voice. Whatever I ultimately decide regarding formal endorsement, know that I am, in whatever capacity an old and stubborn matriarch can manage, proud of the courage you have shown in pursuing this. That much, at least, requires no further deliberation on my part. The meeting between Issei and Lucretia Carmilla took place 3 days later, in the same library where Vanalene had first agreed to build a future alongside him. The ancient matriarch arrived precisely on time, dressed in formal black that managed to convey both severity and a kind of timeless elegance, and studied Issei with an intensity that reminded him, briefly and uncomfortably, of facing down dangerous opponents on a battlefield. "Sit," she said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. "I am told you have a habit of winning over skeptical elders through sincerity rather than political maneuvering. I would like to see whether that reputation is deserved, or merely convenient mythology assembled by people eager to romanticize your circumstances." "Fair enough," Issei said, sitting across from her, doing his best not to let the matriarch's evident scrutiny rattle him. "Ask whatever you want, Lucretia-sama. I'm not interested in performing for you. I'd rather you judge me on what's actually true." "Bold," Lucretia said, something approving in her tone despite the clipped delivery. "Very well. Tell me, young devil, what precisely do you intend to do when the political cost of loving my granddaughter outweighs the convenience? Because it will, eventually. Powerful enemies do not relent simply because a union proves emotionally sincere. There will come a day when standing beside Vanalene costs you something significant, perhaps something irreplaceable. What then?" Issei considered the question seriously, recognizing it was not merely a test but a genuine concern born from centuries of watching political marriages collapse the moment genuine cost entered the equation. "Then I pay the cost," he said simply. "I've already lost things fighting for people I love. Nearly lost my own life more than once. I'm not under any illusion that loving Vanalene, or any of them, means everything stays easy forever. But the alternative, walking away the moment something gets expensive, that's not love. That's convenience wearing love's clothes. I didn't build my whole life around convenience, Lucretia-sama. I built it around people worth fighting for, even when fighting costs something real." Lucretia studied him for a long moment, her ancient eyes unreadable, before something in her severe expression finally, fractionally softened. "I have heard a great many young men make similar declarations over the centuries," she said. "Most of them discovered, when genuine cost finally arrived, that their convictions were considerably shallower than their speeches suggested." She rose slowly from her chair. "I do not yet know which kind of man you are, Issei Hyoudou. But I find, against my considerable expectations, that I am inclined to extend you the opportunity to prove it, rather than dismissing you outright as so many of my granddaughter's previous suitors deserved. That's all I'm asking for," Issei said. "The chance to prove it. Then you shall have it." Lucretia's mouth curved into something that might, on a less severe face, have been called a smile. "I will withhold formal endorsement until the pillar hearing itself, where I intend to observe how you conduct yourself under genuine political pressure before committing this estate's considerable influence. But I will not support Camilla LeBlanc's opposition either. Consider that, for now, the closest thing to a blessing this old matriarch is prepared to offer." When Vanalene found him later that evening, having waited anxiously throughout the entire meeting in an adjoining chamber, Issei relayed the conversation with the same careful honesty he had offered Lucretia herself. "She's not committing either way yet," he said. "But she's not backing Camilla either. I think that's actually a pretty significant win, given how this whole thing started." Vanalene's relief was visible, her shoulders easing in a way Issei had rarely seen from her, centuries of careful political composure giving way to something more openly hopeful. "My grandmother has not extended a suitor that much consideration in longer than I have been alive to witness it," she said. "Whatever you said to her, Issei, it mattered considerably more than you may realize." "I just told her the truth," Issei said. "That seems to be working out better than I expected, this whole process." Vanalene's laugh, soft and genuine, carried none of the careful political distance she had worn into this conversation weeks earlier. "Perhaps," she said, "that is precisely why it has been working. The old families have spent so many centuries performing sincerity as a political tool that they have forgotten what the genuine article actually sounds like, until you walked into their carefully guarded chambers and simply offered it to them plainly. Outside the library's tall windows, the underworld's manufactured twilight settled toward its long artificial night, and within the warm lamplight, Vanalene allowed herself, for the first time in this long political campaign, to believe fully that the family she had chosen might genuinely, against all the old laws and older suspicions arrayed against it, be allowed to stand. Chapter 10. The summons arrived 7 days before the scheduled pillar hearing, delivered not through official underworld channels but by a private courier bearing the seal of the old vampire council itself. Issei broke the wax seal in the Gremory estate's main hall, Rias and Akeno reading over his shoulders, as he unfolded the heavy parchment within. "She wants to meet," Issei said slowly, scanning the formal, precise handwriting. "Privately. Just the two of us, before the hearing." "That seems unlike her," Rias said, frowning. "Lady Camilla has shown no interest in private conversation up to this point. Why change strategy now?" Akeno's expression had turned thoughtful, calculating in the way it always did when she sensed a political trap forming. "Perhaps because public confrontation has not gone the way she expected. You have won over the Yukai Elder Council, secured Barakiel's endorsement, and even managed to unsettle Vanalene's grandmother's certainty regarding Camilla's position. A direct, private conversation may be her attempt to find leverage she has not yet discovered through more conventional means. Or it's an attempt to intimidate him without witnesses," Vanalene said, having arrived partway through the discussion and immediately recognizing her own faction's political patterns at work. "Camilla has done this before, with other targets. Private meetings where she can apply pressure that would look considerably worse if observed by the wider underworld nobility." Issei considered the letter for a long moment. "I'm going to go, Issei. I'm not walking into this blind," he said, meeting Vanalene's concerned gaze steadily. "But I'm also not going to refuse a meeting and let her spend the next 7 days telling every pillar head who listened that I was too afraid to face her directly. I'd rather know exactly what she intends to throw at us before the hearing, instead of being surprised by it in front of the full quorum." In the end, despite considerable protest, the rest of the family agreed, though Vanalene insisted on briefing him extensively beforehand on every political maneuver she had personally witnessed Camilla LeBlanc employ over the centuries, and Surzex quietly arranged for a discreet magical ward to monitor the meeting's location, ensuring that whatever transpired, Issei would not be walking into genuine danger unwitnessed. The meeting took place in a private salon within the old Vampire Council's headquarters, a chamber decorated in severe, old-fashioned elegance that seemed designed specifically to remind visitors of vampire kind's considerable age and accumulated authority. Lady Camilla LeBlanc waited for him there, seated with perfect composure, a single cup of dark tea steaming gently before her. "You came," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "I confess I was not entirely certain you would. Most young men in your position prefer to avoid direct confrontation with their opposition until forced into it by formal proceedings. I'm not most young men in my position," Issei said, settling into the offered chair. "What did you want to discuss, Lady Camilla?" Her thin smile carried no particular warmth, though it held a kind of grudging respect. "Direct. I appreciate that, even if I find your overall ambitions considerably less appealing." She set down her tea, folding her hands precisely. "I want to be transparent with you, Issei Hyoudou, regarding the nature of my opposition, since I suspect the rest of your family has painted me as a simple villain rooted in mindless tradition. I'm listening. I do not oppose this union because I believe vampires, devils, yukai, and fallen blood are inherently incompatible," Camilla said. "I have lived long enough to watch such unions succeed, on occasion, when built with genuine care. My opposition is rooted in something more practical, and frankly, more concerned with the well-being of the very people you claim to be protecting." She leaned forward slightly. "You are 18 years old, Issei Hyoudou. By devil standards, by vampire standards, by nearly every standard relevant to the beings you intend to bind yourself to, you are barely more than a child. Yasaka has lived 1,000 years. Vanalene has lived nearly 3 centuries. Even Akeno Himejima carries fallen angel blood that will see her outlive ordinary human lifespans by a considerable margin. What happens, Issei Hyoudou, when you have aged and they have not? What happens when the great love you speak of so passionately becomes, decades from now, a burden these ancient beings carry out of obligation rather than genuine desire? The question landed with unexpected weight, and Issei found himself momentarily quiet, recognizing the genuine concern buried within Camilla's carefully political framing. "I've thought about that," he admitted finally. "More than you'd probably expect." "Have you?" Camilla said, skepticism evident in her tone. "I have a sacred gear that grants me access to the Juggernaut drive, and beyond that, the kind of power growth that's already pushing my reincarnated devil pieces towards something closer to Yasaka's lifespan or longer, if my power continues developing the way Ajuka Beelzebub's projections suggest it will. I'm not naive about the mortality gap, Lady Camilla. I've had private conversations with Ajuka about exactly this concern, conversations I haven't shared widely because they're not finished yet, and the early results suggest my own lifespan is likely to extend considerably beyond ordinary devil standards, possibly far enough to match or approach the women I'm choosing to build a life with." Camilla's carefully composed expression flickered, genuine surprise visible for the first time since the meeting began. "You have already begun investigating this." "Of course I have," Issei said. "You think I'd ask someone like Yasaka-san, who's lived 1,000 years, to build a family with someone who's going to wither and die in 60 if I hadn't thought seriously about what that actually means? I love them. That doesn't mean I get to be careless about the practical reality of what loving them across that kind of timescale actually requires." He held Camilla's gaze steadily. "I don't have perfect answers yet. Ajuka's research is ongoing, and there's real uncertainty about exactly how my power will continue developing. But I'm not pretending the question doesn't exist, Lady Camilla. I'm actively working to make sure that decades from now, none of them are carrying some obligation they never actually wanted." For a long moment, Camilla LeBlanc said nothing at all, studying him with an expression considerably less hostile than the cold political mask she had worn throughout their previous encounters. "I did not expect that answer," she admitted finally. "Most young suitors in your position either dismiss the concern entirely, certain that love alone resolves practical complications, or avoid the question altogether, hoping nobody examines it too closely before the formal union is secured." She studied him a moment longer. "You have genuinely considered the long arc of this commitment, not merely its immediate emotional satisfaction." "I'm trying to," Issei said. "I won't pretend I have it all figured out. But I'm not walking into this blind to the hard parts, even the ones that won't matter for decades yet." Camilla rose slowly from her chair, crossing to the chamber's window, her back to him for a long moment, as she seemed to weigh something significant. "I will tell you something I have not shared publicly," she said finally, still facing the window. 3 centuries ago, I watched my own sister enter a union with a powerful devil of considerable standing. He loved her, genuinely, in the beginning. But the mortality gap I described to you was never properly addressed, never seriously planned for, and over the following century I watched my sister grow into something brittle and grief-stricken, watching the man she loved age and weaken while her own vampire nature kept her essentially unchanged. By the time he finally passed, she had spent the better part of 50 years anticipating a loss she could do nothing to prevent." Her voice carried old, careful grief beneath its political precision. "I have spent the centuries since determined that no other vampire noble under my protection would suffer that same slow, anticipated heartbreak, simply because nobody bothered to plan seriously for what such a union actually required across time." Issei's chest tightened with sudden understanding. "That's why you've been fighting this so hard. Not tradition for its own sake. You're trying to protect Vanalene from watching me grow old and die while she stays essentially unchanged." "Among other concerns, yes," Camilla admitted. "Vanalene is not merely a political pawn to me, Issei Hyoudou, whatever the rest of your family may have assumed about my motivations. She is family, in the ways that matter most to vampire kind, and I have watched her endure enough disappointment and political manipulation in her relatively short life that I am not eager to see her endure decades of slow, anticipated grief on top of it." The revelation reframed the entire conflict in Issei's mind, the cold political opposition suddenly understandable as something far more sympathetic, however imperfectly expressed. "Then let me show you what I'm doing about it," Issei said. "Properly, with Ajuka's actual research, not just my word for it. I'd rather earn your trust with evidence than ask you to simply take my intentions on faith." Camilla turned back to face him, something considering in her ancient eyes. I would find that considerably more persuasive than the speeches you have apparently been delivering to every other council you have faced this past month, she said, the faintest hint of dry humor entering her voice for the first time. Very well, Issei Hyoudou. Arrange a meeting with Ajuka Beelzebub's research team. Show me genuine evidence that you have planned seriously for the question I have raised. If you can do that, I will reconsider my opposition before the pillar hearing, rather than simply observing it unfold from a hostile position. I can do that, Issei said, relief and renewed determination settling through him in equal measure. As he rose to leave, Camilla's voice stopped him at the chamber's threshold. Issei Hyoudou. He turned back to find her expression considerably softer than it had been throughout their entire previous acquaintance. I will admit, against my own considerable expectations, that you are not entirely the reckless, romantically naive young devil I assumed you to be when this matter first crossed my attention. That does not mean I am prepared to support you yet. But it means I am prepared to listen further, which is more than I have offered most who have stood where you are standing now. That's all I'm asking for, Issei said, echoing the words he had offered Lucretia Carmilla days earlier. The chance to prove it properly. He left the old Vampire Council's headquarters with the late afternoon light slanting long and gold across the underworld's manufactured sky, the weight of Camilla's revelation settling into something he carried seriously rather than dismissively. The fight ahead remained real, and the pillar hearing would still demand everything the family could bring to it. But for the first time since Lady Camilla LeBlanc had first walked into the Gremory Council chamber as an unwelcome observer, Issei found himself thinking of her less as an obstacle to overcome and more as someone whose fears, however imperfectly expressed, deserved to be taken every bit as seriously as the love he was fighting to protect. Chapter 11. Ajuka Beelzebub's research laboratory occupied an entire isolated tower within the underworld's scientific district, its interior a strange and humming landscape of magical instrumentation, glowing containment circles, and towering shelves of research notes spanning centuries of devil magical theory. Issei had been here perhaps a dozen times over the years, usually for matters related to his sacred gear's continued development, but never before with quite this much riding on what the data might reveal. Lady Camilla LeBlanc arrived precisely on schedule, dressed in the same severe formal black she favored, though something in her bearing today carried less hostility and more genuine, careful curiosity. Ajuka himself greeted her with the easy, distracted warmth of a scientist more comfortable with theoretical frameworks than diplomatic pleasantries, gesturing them both toward a long table covered in projected charts and shimmering magical readouts. Lady Camilla. Issei tells me you have concerns regarding longevity projections relevant to his proposed union, Ajuka said, without preamble, already pulling up additional data with an idle gesture. I think you will find the research considerably more developed than perhaps you expected. I would appreciate a thorough explanation, Camilla said, settling into the offered chair with careful, evaluating attention. I am not a scientist by training, but I am quite capable of following technical detail when it is presented clearly. Ajuka nodded, beginning to walk them through the projected data with the patient thoroughness of someone genuinely passionate about the underlying research. Issei's sacred gear, the boosted gear, is one of the 13 Longinus class artifacts, capable of theoretically unlimited power growth given sufficient time and proper development. What is less widely understood, even within devil scientific circles, is the relationship between sustained Longinus development and the host's underlying biological and magical aging processes. He gestured, and a complex chart unfolded in shimmering light above the table, tracking projected power curves alongside corresponding longevity estimates. In simple terms, sustained access to power on the scale Issei has already demonstrated, and continues to develop, produces a stabilizing effect on cellular and magical degradation, the same fundamental processes that govern aging in both human and devil physiology. We have observed similar, though less pronounced, effects in other Longinus hosts throughout recorded history, though Issei's case is unusually clear given how extensively we have been able to track his development since his original reincarnation. What does that mean, in practical terms? Camilla asked. For the lifespan you are projecting? Conservatively, Ajuka said, based on current development trajectories, Issei's effective lifespan is likely to extend well beyond standard devil norms, potentially into ranges comparable to high-ranking devil nobility, possibly further depending on how his power continues to mature over the coming decades. I want to be clear that this remains an active area of research, and I would not claim perfect certainty. But the early data does not support the scenario you described to him regarding standard mortal aging proceeding unchecked alongside an unaging ancient partner. Camilla studied the projected charts for a long moment, her expression carefully unreadable, though Issei could see something shifting behind her ancient eyes as she absorbed the implications. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that the very power Issei has spent his life accumulating, the power that initially alarmed the old families enough to raise concerns about concentrated influence, is also the mechanism by which the mortality concern I raised is substantially mitigated." "That is a reasonably accurate summary, yes," Ajuka agreed. "Though I would add, for the sake of complete honesty, that mitigation is not the same as elimination. There remains genuine uncertainty in long-term projections of this kind. I cannot promise you with absolute scientific certainty that Issei will live precisely as long as Yasaka or Vanalene. What I can tell you is that the scenario of ordinary human aging proceeding unchecked while his partners remain ageless, the specific tragedy you described witnessing with your sister, does not match what the data suggests is likely to occur here." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, processing the information with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had spent centuries learning not to accept easy reassurance without genuine scrutiny. "Show me the raw data," she said finally. "Not the summary projections. I would like to examine the underlying methodology myself, if you are willing to permit that level of scrutiny." "I would be disappointed if you did not ask," Ajuka said, something like genuine respect entering his typically distracted tone. "Careful skepticism is precisely how good science survives contact with hopeful assumptions. Please take whatever time you require." For the better part of 2 hours, Camilla worked through the underlying research with meticulous attention, occasionally pausing to ask sharp, technically precise questions that Ajuka clearly enjoyed answering, the two of them falling into the particular rhythm of careful intellectual engagement that transcended their initial political opposition. Issei mostly stayed quiet during this portion, recognizing that his presence was largely unnecessary to the genuine scientific evaluation unfolding before him, though he watched with growing, cautious hope as Camilla's careful scrutiny gradually, visibly, gave way to something closer to genuine satisfaction. Finally, she set down the final report, removing the reading glasses she had donned partway through her review, and turned to face Issei directly. "I came into this meeting prepared to find convenient, hopeful assumptions dressed up as scientific reassurance," she said. "I have, instead, found rigorous, carefully caveated research that takes the concern I raised with you seriously rather than dismissing it. That is, I will admit, more than I expected from a young devil I assumed to be operating largely on romantic conviction rather than careful planning." "I told you I'd been thinking about it more than you'd expect," Issei said. "You did," Camilla agreed. "And I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I believe you." She rose slowly, gathering her composure with the practiced ease of someone who had spent centuries navigating difficult political reversals gracefully. "I will not pretend my opposition has entirely vanished, Issei Hyoudou. There remain other concerns regarding precedent, political stability, and the broader implications of concentrated power across multiple factions that this meeting has not addressed. But the specific fear that drove my opposition most personally, the fear of watching another vampire I care for endure the same slow grief my sister suffered, that fear has been substantially eased today." "Does that mean you'll support the union at the hearing?" Issei asked, not quite daring to hope too openly. "It means," Camilla said carefully, "that I no longer intend to actively oppose it. I will withhold formal endorsement, much as Lucretia Carmilla has done, reserving final judgment for the hearing itself, where I intend to observe how this union withstands genuine scrutiny from the full quorum of pillar heads. But I will not be the voice rallying opposition against you that I might otherwise have become." A faint, genuine smile touched her severe features, the first Issei had seen from her in their entire acquaintance. "Consider that, Issei Hyoudou, a considerably more significant shift than perhaps you fully appreciate." As Camilla departed the laboratory, pausing briefly to thank Ajuka for his thorough and patient explanation, Issei felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the formal opposition first began weeks ago. It was not victory, not yet, not with the full pillar hearing still looming ahead. But it was something real, something earned through patient, careful honesty rather than political maneuvering, and that felt, in its own quiet way, like exactly the kind of foundation worth building the rest of this family's future on top of. Ajuka, watching the door close behind Camilla's departing figure, turned back to Issei with a thoughtful expression. "You handled that rather well," he said. "Most young devils your age would have either dismissed her concern entirely or panicked at the prospect of genuine scientific scrutiny revealing some inconvenient truth about their circumstances. I wasn't worried about the scrutiny," Issei admitted. "I was worried about whether the answer would actually be good news. I've thought about this for a long time, Ajuka. Long before Camilla raised it directly. I don't think I could have asked any of them to build a life with me without being honest about it, even with myself first." Ajuka studied him for a long moment, something almost paternal in his usually distracted, scientific demeanor. "You know," he said, "when Serzex first proposed that I monitor your sacred gear's development so closely, all those years ago, I confess my primary interest was purely academic. A Longinus host developing at the rate you demonstrated represented a fascinating research opportunity, nothing more." He smiled faintly. "I find, watching you navigate this past month's considerable political and personal challenges, that my interest has become rather less academic and rather more personal than I anticipated. I am, for whatever it is worth from an old researcher more comfortable with equations than sentiment, quite genuinely invested in seeing this family you are building succeed. That actually means a lot, Ajuka." "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Ajuka said, returning his attention to the glowing data still suspended above the table. "Thank me once the pillar hearing concludes successfully. Until then, there remains considerable work left to do, and I suspect the coming days will demand every bit as much careful preparation as the past month already has." Issei nodded, the weight of what remained ahead settling back over him, real and substantial, but no longer carrying the same sharp edge of uncertainty it once had. Piece by piece, conversation by conversation, the foundation beneath this family he was building had grown steadier, more solid, more genuinely earned than he had dared hope when Serzex first posed his impossible question weeks ago. The pillar hearing waited now, less than a week away, the final and most significant hurdle standing between the family he had chosen and the formal recognition that would let them build their future without the constant threat of old laws and older suspicions hanging over every quiet moment of happiness they had fought so hard to protect. Chapter 12. The night before the pillar hearing, the old schoolhouse that served as the Occult Research Club's headquarters filled with more people than it had ever comfortably held, and yet somehow, in the warm lamplight and easy noise of overlapping conversation, it felt exactly the right size for what the evening had become. Issei's parents had come, his mother fussing happily over a spread of homemade food she had insisted on preparing despite Graphia's gentle protests that the estate's kitchen staff would have happily handled catering. Kunu had arrived from Kyoto with Yasaka, practically vibrating with excitement about tomorrow's proceedings, having appointed herself unofficial strategic advisor despite repeated gentle reminders that her role tomorrow would primarily involve sitting quietly and looking dignified. Vanalene had come too, her usual careful composure softened by the easy warmth of an evening that asked nothing political of her, simply the comfortable presence of people who had become, over these past weeks of shared struggle, genuinely and irreversibly family. Even Barakiel had made an appearance, brief and somewhat awkward in the unfamiliar context of casual social gathering, but present nonetheless, watching his daughter with quiet, unguarded pride as she moved easily between conversations, laughing at something Akeno Himejima had said, completely at ease in a room full of people who loved her without reservation. "I still can't quite believe this is the same group of people," Rias said, settling beside Issei near the room's edge, watching the warm chaos unfold before them. "A month ago, half these people had never met each other. Now look at it. Feels like it's always been like this," Issei said, and meant it. "Like we just needed everyone to actually be in the same room together for it to become obvious." "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Rias asked, her crimson eyes searching his face with the particular perceptiveness she had honed over years of reading him accurately even when he tried to hide his feelings behind easy confidence. Issei considered the question honestly. A little. Not about whether I love any of you, or whether this is worth fighting for. I'm sure about that. I'm nervous about whether we've done enough, whether the pillar heads who haven't already made up their minds will actually listen the way the Yukai Council did, the way Camilla eventually did. We've done everything we reasonably could, Rias said. Barakiel's endorsement. The Yukai Elder Council's formal approval. Lucretia Carmilla withholding opposition rather than supporting Camilla. Camilla herself softening considerably since the laboratory meeting. Vanalene tells me she's secured at least cautious sympathy from 4 additional pillar heads through her own careful political work this past week. She took his hand, squeezing gently. Whatever happens tomorrow, Issei, you have already built something real. The hearing simply determines whether the old laws formally recognize what already, genuinely exists. Across the room, Akeno had drawn Issei's mother into an animated conversation about something that made Akiko laugh brightly, the easy warmth between them carrying none of the awkwardness that might once have accompanied a fallen angel's daughter meeting her partner's entirely human mother. Issei watched them for a moment, something settling warm and certain in his chest. Can I ask you something? He said, turning back to Rias. Of course. Are you scared? Of what this means for the Gremory clan, long term. You're heir to one of the great houses. This isn't just my political fight, it's yours too, and I don't think I've asked enough whether the cost feels worth it from where you're standing. Rias was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously rather than offering an easy reassurance. I would be lying if I said there was no cost, she admitted. My mother has expressed concerns, careful and diplomatic, about how this union complicates traditional Gremory succession planning. There will be those among the 72 pillars who view this as evidence that the Gremory line has grown reckless, willing to entangle itself with vampire and Yukai politics in ways previous generations carefully avoided. She met his eyes steadily. But I have spent my entire life being told what the Gremory legacy requires of me, Issei. What kind of devil I am permitted to be, what kind of family I am permitted to build, what kind of love is considered appropriately strategic versus recklessly sentimental. I am done allowing that legacy to define the shape of my own happiness. If preserving some narrow, traditional version of Gremory respectability costs me the family I actually want, then I have already decided that legacy is not one worth preserving in its current form. That's a pretty big thing to decide. I decided it a long time ago, Rias said, echoing words she had spoken weeks earlier in this same room, when this entire journey had still felt impossibly large. I am only finally brave enough to say it plainly, the way you taught me to be. Across the room, a sudden burst of laughter drew their attention, Kanu apparently having delivered some particularly cutting assessment of Lady Camilla LeBlanc's political tactics that had Vanalene laughing so hard she had to set down her drink, while Yasaka looked on with the particular expression of a mother simultaneously proud and faintly concerned about her daughter's evident political savvy at such a young age. She's going to be a force to be reckoned with someday, Issei said, watching Kunu with open affection. She already is, Akeno said, having drifted over to join them, slipping her arm comfortably around Issei's waist. I overheard her informing Barakiel-san earlier that she intends to personally oversee the wedding arrangements once tomorrow's hearing concludes successfully, regardless of anyone else's opinion on the matter. That sounds about right, Issei laughed. As the evening deepened, the easy warmth of the gathering settling into something quieter, more contemplative, Issei found himself drawn outside onto the schoolhouse's familiar grounds, needing a moment of stillness before tomorrow's enormous proceedings. The autumn night was clear and cold, stars visible above the old gate where, weeks ago, he had first stood lost in the impossible weight of Surzex's question. He was not surprised when, one by one, the 4 of them joined him there, Rias first, then Akeno, then Vanalene slipping quietly out from the warm noise inside, and finally Yasaka, having settled Kunu into an animated conversation with Issei's father about something involving fox spirit history that seemed likely to occupy the both of them for some time yet. Quite a crowd we've gathered, Vanalene observed, looking back toward the warmly lit windows of the schoolhouse. Quite a family, Yasaka corrected gently. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the cold night air sharp and clear around them, the weight of tomorrow's hearing present but no longer crushing, transformed somewhere over these past difficult weeks into something they faced together rather than something any of them carried alone. Whatever happens tomorrow, Issei said finally, I want you all to know something. I'm proud of what we've built, regardless of how the hearing goes. The pillarheads can grant their formal recognition or withhold it, but they can't undo what's already real between us. They can't take away Barakiel's reconciliation with his daughter, or Kunu's certainty about her place in this family, or Lucretia Carmilla finally extending her granddaughter the trust she deserved a decade ago. That's already ours. No council vote changes that. Rias's hand found his, and one by one, the others joined, until the 5 of them stood together beneath the same old gate where this entire journey had quietly begun, hands linked, the weight of tomorrow settled into something steadier than fear. Then let us face it properly, Rias said, the same way we have faced everything else. Together, Akeno agreed. Together, Vanalene echoed, something fierce and certain entering her voice. Together, Yasaka finished, ancient and warm and utterly unshakable. Above them, the underworld's manufactured stars settled into their familiar patterns, and somewhere within the schoolhouse, the warm sound of a family gathering continued, unaware that just outside, beneath the old gate, 5 people had quietly, finally, settled the only question that had ever truly mattered, long before tomorrow's hearing would attempt to settle the rest. Tomorrow would bring the 72 pillars, the formal proceedings, the careful political calculations that remained despite everything they had already accomplished. But tonight, standing together beneath familiar stars, none of that felt like it carried the power to undo what had already, genuinely, irrevocably become real. Chapter 13. The Hall of the 72 Pillars had not been filled to capacity in over a decade, not since the formal ratification of the last great peace treaty between the 3 biblical factions had drawn every great devil house to witness history in the making. Today, as Issei stood in the antechamber outside its towering doors, he understood with sudden, visceral clarity that whatever was about to happen inside carried, for him at least, every bit as much weight as that historic treaty had carried for the underworld as a whole. Nervous? Surzex asked, appearing beside him with the easy, unhurried grace that had carried him through centuries of far more dangerous political proceedings than this one. Terrified, Issei admitted. But not about losing. About whether I've actually prepared everyone well enough. About whether there's some question I haven't thought to anticipate that's going to blindside us in there. There likely is, Surzex said, with the particular honesty that had made Issei trust him from the earliest days of their acquaintance. There always is, in proceedings like this. The 72 pillars contain considerable diversity of opinion, ambition, and old grievance, and no amount of preparation fully anticipates every angle a determined opponent might pursue. He placed a steady hand on Issei's shoulder. But I have watched you navigate considerably more dangerous uncertainty than a hostile question in a formal hearing, Issei. Trust the foundation you have built these past weeks. It is more solid than you currently feel it to be. Through the antechamber's narrow window, Issei could see the hall's interior beginning to fill, devil nobility arriving in formal procession according to ancient protocols of precedence and rank, the great families of the 72 pillars taking their seats in tiered galleries that rose toward the hall's vaulted ceiling. He spotted familiar faces among them. Sona Citri, arriving with her own small entourage, offering Issei a brief, supportive nod through the window before taking her family's seat. Members of the old Baal clan, expressions carefully neutral. Representatives of the Phoenix line, whose history with Issei carried its own particular complications given his role in the broken engagement between Rias and Riser years past. And near the hall's center, in a position of some prominence given the formal nature of today's proceedings, Lady Camilla LeBlanc sat beside an elderly vampire noble Issei did not immediately recognize, her expression carefully composed but, he noted with cautious hope, considerably less hostile than it had been weeks earlier. The others are already inside, Rias said, joining him in the antechamber, dressed in formal Gremory crimson that carried centuries of careful tradition in its every careful detail. Mother and father have taken their seats. Grafia is overseeing the formal proceedings on Surzex's behalf. Akeno and Vanalene and Yasaka are waiting near the petitioner's gallery, ready to testify when called. And Kunu? A faint smile touched Rias's composed expression. Seated beside Yasaka, dressed in formal court attire, looking considerably more dignified than I expected an 8-year-old to manage under this kind of pressure. I suspect she has been practicing her composed expression in front of a mirror for days. Issei laughed despite the tension coiled tight in his chest, grateful for the small moment of levity before whatever waited inside the hall. How are you feeling about all this? Ready, Rias said simply. We have done everything within our power to prepare for this moment. Whatever happens now, Issei, we face it the same way we have faced everything else. She took his hand, squeezing gently. Together, the great doors of the hall began their slow, ceremonial opening, ancient mechanisms grinding with the particular weight of centuries of formal tradition, and beyond them, Issei could see the full assembly of the 72 pillars settling into expectant silence, waiting for the proceedings that would determine, in no small part, the shape of the family he had spent the past month fighting to protect. It's time, Surzex said quietly. Issei drew a steadying breath, squared his shoulders, and walked through the opening doors into the hall of the 72 pillars, Rias beside him, ready to face whatever the gathered nobility of the entire underworld had assembled to determine. The hall's interior was even more imposing from within than its exterior architecture had suggested, tiered galleries rising in concentric rings around a central speaking floor, each tier representing the assembled great houses according to ancient precedents, their banners hanging in careful order along the curved walls above. Surzex took his position at the hall's formal head, the symbolic seat of Lucifer rising above the central floor with appropriate ceremonial gravity, while Grafia settled into the role of formal proceedings overseer beside him. Issei found his place at the petitioner's podium near the hall's center, Rias taking her position beside him, while Akeno, Yasaka, Vanalene, and Kuna settled into the witnesses' gallery just beyond, ready to be called forward when the formal proceedings required their testimony. Grafia's voice, amplified by careful magical projection, carried clearly through the hall's vast silence. This hearing is called to order, before the assembled quorum of the 72 pillars, to consider the formal petition of Issei Hyoudou, reincarnated devil of the Gremory peerage, seeking ratification of a mixed union under the provisions of the Concordat of Mixed Houses, joining the Gremory Devil House, the Himejima fallen lineage, the ruling house of Kyoto's Yukai, and the Carmilla vampire faction. A low murmur rippled through the assembled galleries, the formal recitation of the union's full scope landing with visible weight even among nobility who had, by now, heard considerable rumor about the petition's contents over the preceding weeks. The petitioner has satisfied the Concordat's preliminary requirements, Grafia continued. Formal endorsement has been received and verified from Barakil of the Gregory Governing Council, from the Yukai Elder Council of Kyoto under the seal of Yasaka-sama, and from Vanalene of the Carmilla faction in her own capacity as senior noble. The required period of demonstrated cohabitation and mutual support has been established through testimony and evidence already submitted to this council's preliminary review. She paused, surveying the assembled hall with the same crisp, unflinching authority she brought to everything. This hearing now proceeds to its final stage. Any house represented within this quorum may raise formal objection to the proposed union, which the petitioner and his intended partners will have full opportunity to address. Following all objections and responses, the full quorum will proceed to formal vote, requiring a clear majority to grant ratification. The hall fell into expectant silence, every gaze settling on the assembled galleries, waiting to see which house would be first to rise and formally challenge what Issei had spent the past month carefully building toward this exact moment. It was not, as Issei half expected, Lady Camilla LeBlanc who rose first. Instead, from a tier representing one of the older, more conservative devil houses, an elderly noble Issei did not recognize rose slowly to his feet, his expression carrying the particular severity of someone who had spent centuries defending tradition against what he perceived as reckless modern overreach. Lord Astaroth of the Astaroth clan, Grafia announced formally. You are recognized to raise objection. Thank you, Lady Grafia. Lord Astaroth's voice carried clearly through the hall, carefully measured despite its evident edge. I rise not to question the sincerity of the affection involved in this proposed union. I have heard, as I suspect most of this assembly has heard, considerable testimony regarding the genuine emotional bonds at its center. My concern is more structural in nature. He turned to address the hall more broadly, falling into the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to formal rhetoric. The Concordat of Mixed Houses was established specifically to prevent the kind of concentrated cross-faction power this union represents. Regardless of the sincerity behind it, we would be establishing a precedent in which a single reincarnated devil, still remarkably young by underworld standards, commands formal alliance with vampire nobility, the ruling house of an entire Yukai territory, and significant standing within the Gregory's broader political sphere, alongside his existing position within one of our most prestigious devil clans. I ask this assembly to consider, soberly, what precedent we establish today, and whether future ambitious devils might seek to replicate this concentration of cross-faction influence through considerably less sincere means than what Issei Hyoudou has, by all accounts, genuinely demonstrated. The objection landed with visible weight across the gathered galleries, murmurs of consideration rippling through tears that had, until now, remained carefully neutral. It was, Issei recognized immediately, a far more dangerous challenge than simple prejudice or old grievance. Lord Astaroth was not arguing against the sincerity of his love. He was arguing against the structural precedent it might establish, regardless of how genuinely it had been built. Serzex's expression remained carefully neutral, though Issei caught the faint flicker of respect in his eyes, recognizing, as Issei himself now did, that this was precisely the kind of substantive challenge the hearing had been designed to surface. The petitioner may respond, Grafia said. Issei stepped forward to the podium's edge, drawing a steadying breath, recognizing that this moment would likely set the tone for everything that followed. Lord Astaroth raises a fair concern, Issei said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's careful acoustics. I'm not going to pretend the precedent question doesn't matter, or try to argue that concentrated cross-faction power is never dangerous. It can be. History's shown us that clearly enough. He paused, gathering his thoughts carefully. But I'd ask this assembly to consider what actually distinguishes a genuine union built through years of earned trust from the kind of manufactured alliance Lord Astaroth is rightly concerned about preventing. He gestured toward the witnesses' gallery, where Akeno, Yasaka, Vanalene, and Kunu waited. This council has already verified formal endorsement from 3 separate faction leaders, each independently satisfied that this union was entered freely, without coercion, after genuine examination of my character and intentions. The Yukai Elder Council didn't simply take my word for it. Elder Karasu Tenma raised direct historical precedent about devils using exactly this kind of alliance, as a means of slow territorial absorption, and I had to earn his trust through concrete, written protections, not empty promises. Lucretia Carmilla withheld her own endorsement specifically to observe today's proceedings before committing her considerable influence either way. He met Lord Astaroth's gaze directly. I'd propose this assembly consider establishing exactly the kind of safeguard you're describing, not by denying this union, but by formally requiring the same rigorous, independent verification process I've already undergone for any future petition of this kind. Require genuine endorsement from each faction's actual leadership, not merely procedural sign-off. Require demonstrated, sustained cohabitation and mutual support, verified independently, the way mine already has been. If a future devil's intentions are as cynical as the precedent you're rightly worried about, that kind of rigorous scrutiny will surface it long before any formal hearing like this one. A considering murmur swept through the gallery, and Lord Astaroth, after a long moment of evident deliberation, inclined his head slightly. A reasonable proposal, he admitted. I do not withdraw my concern entirely, but I acknowledge the petitioner has addressed it with more substance than I anticipated. He took his seat, the immediate tension of his objection easing into something more measured, though clearly the precedent question would remain part of the broader discussion still to come. Beside Issei, Rias let out a quiet breath of relief, though her expression remained carefully composed for the watching assembly. That went better than I feared, she murmured. One objection down, Issei said, equally quiet. I don't think we're anywhere close to finish yet. He was right. Even as Lord Astaroth settled back into his seat, Issei could see, across the assembled galleries, several more nobles beginning to rise, their expressions carrying the particular determination of people who had come prepared with objections considerably more pointed than structural precedent alone. The hearing, it was becoming increasingly clear, had only just begun. Chapter 14. The next objection came from the Phoenix Gallery, and the moment the noble rose to his feet, Issei recognized him immediately. Lord Phoenix himself, Riser's father, his expression carrying none of his son's old arrogance, but something more careful, more genuinely troubled. Lord Phoenix of the Phoenix clan, you are recognized, Graphia announced. Thank you. Lord Phoenix's voice carried less rhetorical polish than Lord Astaroth's had, something more personal beneath its formal cadence. I will be direct, given the history between my family and this petitioner. I bear no particular grudge regarding the broken engagement between my son and Rias Gremory. Riser himself has long since acknowledged that arrangement was poorly conceived from its inception, built on political convenience rather than genuine compatibility. He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. But I confess I find myself troubled by a different concern than my colleague Lord Astaroth raised. I am troubled by the question of consent, and more specifically, by whether the women involved in this petition have been given genuine, unpressured opportunity to choose this path, or whether the considerable social and political momentum surrounding Issei Hyoudou's rapid rise has made refusal practically unthinkable, regardless of their actual private wishes. The objection landed differently than Lord Astaroth's had, quieter but somehow sharper, and Issei felt a flash of genuine alarm, not at the accusation itself, which he knew to be unfounded, but at how difficult it might prove to disprove something so fundamentally about internal experience rather than external fact. I would like, Lord Phoenix continued, to hear directly from each of the women involved, in their own words, without the petitioner present to potentially influence their testimony. I do not say this to suggest deliberate manipulation. I say this because genuine consent, particularly in situations involving significant power imbalance, deserves to be verified as carefully and independently as possible. Surzex's expression remained carefully neutral, though Graphia glanced toward him briefly before responding. The request is reasonable under the Concordat's provisions for independent verification, she said. The petitioner will withdraw to the antechamber, while each woman testifies individually before the full quorum. Issei felt his stomach drop slightly, the prospect of being formally excluded from this portion of the hearing, unable to see or hear how his family responded to a question that struck so directly at the heart of everything he had tried to build, landing with unexpected weight. But he understood immediately, even through the discomfort, that Lord Phoenix's request was not unreasonable. If anything, it was precisely the kind of careful scrutiny that protected against exactly the structural danger Lord Astaroth had raised earlier. I understand, Issei said quietly, and allowed Graphia's attendants to escort him from the central floor toward the antechamber, casting one final glance back at Rias, whose steady, reassuring nod carried more confidence than Issei currently felt himself. In the antechamber, the wait stretched agonizingly, Issei pacing the narrow space while Surzex, who had remained outside to keep him company despite his own formal obligations within the hearing, watched with quiet, patient understanding. This is exactly the right way to handle that concern, Surzex said eventually, breaking the tense silence. I know it feels difficult, being excluded from a conversation about your own relationships. But Lord Phoenix's request protects you as much as it protects the women you love, Issei. A union built on genuine, freely given consent has nothing to fear from this kind of independent verification. If anything, surviving this scrutiny only strengthens the legitimacy of what you have built. I know that, logically, Issei admitted. Doesn't make the waiting any easier. He did not have to wait much longer. The antechamber's narrow window allowed a partial view into the hall's interior, though the careful acoustic design meant he could see far more than he could hear, watching figures move and gesture without clear sound carrying through the heavy stone walls. He watched Rias step forward first, her posture confident and unhurried, speaking for what appeared to be several minutes before returning to her seat. Then Akeno, her testimony similarly extended, her expression at one point carrying visible emotion that even the muffled distance could not entirely obscure. Then Yasaka, ancient and composed, gesturing at one point toward where Kunu sat watching with evident pride, Then Vanalene, her testimony notably the longest, several pillar heads leaning forward with evident interest at whatever she was explaining. Finally, to Issei's considerable surprise, he watched Kuno herself rise and approach the speaking floor, small and solemn in her formal court attire, addressing the assembly with the same composed dignity she had shown before the Yukai Elder Council weeks earlier. It was nearly 40 minutes before Graphia's attendant finally returned to escort him back into the hall, and Issei found himself searching the assembled faces desperately for some indication of how the testimony had gone, finding little clarity in the carefully composed expressions of the gathered nobility. The petitioner may return to the floor, Graphia announced formally, and Issei resumed his position at the podium, Rias rejoining him with a small, reassuring smile that eased some of his anxiety, though not entirely. Lord Phoenix rose once more, his expression considerably softer than it had been before the testimony began. I want to thank this council, and the 4 women who testified, for their patience with what I recognize was a difficult request. He turned to address Issei directly for the first time. I will summarize, for the petitioner's benefit, the substance of what this assembly heard, though I encourage each woman to share further detail as she sees fit, should she wish to. He drew a slow breath. Rias Gremory testified that she has, on multiple occasions over the past several years, deliberately created opportunities for the petitioner to pursue alternative romantic or political arrangements, including formal introductions to other eligible devil nobility, specifically to ensure he never felt obligated to remain bound to her circle out of social momentum rather than genuine choice. She testified that he consistently declined these opportunities, not from social pressure, but from what she described as quiet, consistent preference for the family already forming around him. Issei's chest tightened with surprised recognition. He remembered those introductions vaguely, framed at the time as simple social courtesy rather than the deliberate test Rias had apparently intended them to be. Akeno Himejima testified, Lord Phoenix continued, that she spent considerable time, particularly in the early years of their acquaintance, deliberately testing whether the petitioner's affection extended only to the parts of her that were conventionally appealing, or whether it extended fully to the fallen angel lineage she had spent years ashamed of. She testified that on multiple occasions, she deliberately revealed aspects of that lineage in ways designed to provoke discomfort or rejection, and that the petitioner's consistent, unwavering acceptance through each test ultimately became the foundation of trust upon which her choice to pursue this union was built, freely and without external pressure. Akeno, Issei noted, was watching him now with an expression carrying both vulnerability and quiet pride, and he found himself wanting, badly, to cross the floor and hold her properly, though the formal proceedings made that impossible for the moment. Yasaka of Kyoto testified, Lord Phoenix went on, that as ruler of an entire Yukai territory, she has spent centuries fielding political marriage proposals from devils, gods, and other Yukai factions alike, each one carefully calculated for strategic advantage rather than genuine affection. She testified that she recognized, almost immediately upon meeting the petitioner, that his concern for her daughter's safety during a moment of genuine crisis carried none of that strategic calculation, and that her subsequent choice to pursue this union was made with the full clarity of someone who has had 1,000 years of practice recognizing manipulation, and found none present in this case. Vanalene of the Carmilla faction testified, Lord Phoenix continued, his voice softening further, regarding her own history of political marriage negotiations that treated her affections as entirely secondary to bloodline and territorial considerations. She testified, in considerable and at times difficult detail, about the specific moment she recognized the petitioner as the first person in her considerable life who had ever simply asked what she wanted, without an agenda attached to the answer. She stated, and I quote her testimony directly given its evident significance, that her choice to pursue this union represents the single freest decision of her entire existence, made entirely on her own terms, for the first time in nearly 3 centuries. The hall had fallen into a particular, weighted silence, the formal recitation of such personal testimony carrying real emotional gravity even through Lord Phoenix's careful, measured delivery. And finally he said the Yukai Kuno, though her testimony carries no formal weight under the Concordat's adult consent provisions, asked to address this council regardless, and I found her testimony sufficiently relevant to include in this summary. She stated, in her own words, that she had personally observed the petitioner's character across 2 years of close acquaintance, and that she considered any suggestion that her mother had been manipulated or pressured into this union to be, and again I quote her testimony directly, considerably less informed than her own assessment as someone who actually lives in the same household. A ripple of surprised, genuine laughter moved through the assembled galleries at the directness of an 8-year-old's testimony being formally entered into council record, and even Lord Phoenix's expression carried a faint, reluctant smile. "I withdraw my objection," he said finally, turning to address the full assembly. "I came into this hearing with genuine concern regarding consent and power imbalance. I leave it satisfied that this union has been built on foundations considerably more solid, and considerably more freely chosen, than I had reason to expect when I first rose to speak." He took his seat, and Issei felt, for the first time since the hearing began, something like genuine hope take firm hold in his chest, though he understood, even through the relief, that the proceedings remained far from finished, and that whatever waited in the objections still to come might yet prove considerably more difficult to navigate than the 2 challenges already addressed. Chapter 15. The third objection arrived with a different energy entirely, and Issei felt the shift in the hall's atmosphere before the speaker had even fully risen. From a gallery Issei did not immediately recognize, representing a smaller, less prominent devil house, a younger noble stood with the particular sharp, eager hostility of someone who had come prepared for confrontation rather than genuine deliberation. Lord Glaciolabalas, of the minor branch families, Graphia announced, a faint note of careful neutrality in her formal introduction that suggested even she recognized this objection might carry a different character than what had preceded it. "Thank you, Lady Graphia." Lord Glaciolabalas's voice carried barely concealed contempt beneath its formal courtesy. "I confess I have listened to this morning's proceedings with growing concern, watching this assembly grow increasingly charmed by what amounts to little more than a well-rehearsed performance of sincerity. I would like to remind this council of something my colleagues seem strangely eager to forget. Issei Hyoudou is the host of one of the 13 Longinus-class sacred gears, possessing access, however carefully managed, to the Juggernaut Drive, a transformation historically associated with catastrophic loss of control and devastating destruction." A murmur of unease rippled through several galleries, old fears surfacing despite Issei's years of demonstrated control. "We are being asked," Glaciolabalas continued, his voice rising with rhetorical momentum, "to formally bind together vampire nobility, an entire Yukai territory, fallen angel lineage, and one of our most prestigious devil clans, all under the influence of a single individual who carries within him the seed of potentially apocalyptic destructive power. I do not question his sincerity in matters of romantic affection. I question the wisdom of this entire assembly in concentrating such catastrophic risk within a single household, regardless of how genuinely that household loves one another." He turned, addressing the hall more broadly now, clearly relishing the attention his pointed rhetoric had captured. "What happens, honored colleagues, if control ever fails? What happens if the considerable stress of managing 4 separate factional relationships, 4 sets of competing political obligations, 4 entirely different sets of expectations regarding his time and attention, proves too much even for someone of Issei Hyoudou's evident strength of character? We would not merely be witnessing a personal tragedy. We would be witnessing the Juggernaut Drive unleashed at the heart of a union connecting 4 of the underworld's most significant factions, with catastrophic implications for every house represented within this hall." The accusation, unlike the previous 2 objections, carried genuine fear-mongering beneath its formal presentation, and Issei felt his jaw tighten, recognizing the deliberate manipulation even as he understood how effectively it might land with an audience already carrying old, deep-seated anxiety about uncontrolled Longinus power. Before Issei could formulate a response, however, Surzex himself rose from his formal seat, his expression carrying a controlled intensity Issei had rarely witnessed from him in their years of acquaintance. "I would like to address this concern directly," Surzex said, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its measured calm, "given that I have personally overseen Issei Hyoudou's power development since his earliest days as a reincarnated devil. And given that the accusation just leveled touches on matters of considerable technical complexity that this assembly may not be fully equipped to evaluate without expert context." He He gestured, and Graphia, anticipating his intent, activated a series of magical projections displaying detailed records spanning years of careful documentation. Issei Hyoudu's relationship with the Juggernaut Drive is, I will state clearly for this assembly's benefit, considerably more sophisticated than Lord Glagialabalas's characterization suggests. Working closely with the Juka Beelzebub's research team, Issei has developed what we term Cardinal Crimson Promotion, a means of accessing significant portions of his sacred gear's full power while maintaining complete cognitive control, specifically designed to avoid the catastrophic loss of control historically associated with uncontrolled Juggernaut Drive activation. He paused, allowing the technical detail to settle before continuing. More relevant to today's proceedings, however, is the simple observed reality of how Issei Hyoudou has actually managed stress and emotional difficulty across the considerable trials he has already faced. I would remind this assembly that he fought through the entirety of the Chaos Brigade conflict, including watching close companions nearly die before his eyes on multiple occasions, without once losing control of his power in a manner that endangered innocent life. I would remind this assembly that he has, over these past several weeks alone, navigated considerable political pressure, hostile questioning, and the genuine emotional weight of advocating for the family he loves before increasingly skeptical audiences, all without the slightest indication of the catastrophic instability Lord Glagialabalas suggests is somehow inevitable. Surzex's gaze swept the assembled galleries with quiet, unmistakable authority. I do not say this to dismiss the genuine technical risk associated with Longinus class power. That risk is real, and this council would be foolish to ignore it entirely in any circumstance. But I would caution this assembly against confusing theoretical risk with the specific, demonstrated pattern of behavior we have actually observed from this particular individual across years of considerable evidence. Issei Hyoudou has shown us, repeatedly and consistently, that emotional stability and genuine connection to the people he loves makes him stronger and more controlled, not less. The very bonds Lord Glagialabalas characterizes as potential destabilizing stress are, by every observable measure available to this council, precisely the foundation that keeps his considerable power most safely and effectively managed. A considering murmur swept through the hall, the technical authority of Surzex's intervention carrying visible weight even among nobles who had seemed genuinely unsettled by Glagialabalas's rhetoric moments earlier. Issei, recognizing the moment required his own voice rather than relying entirely on Surzex's defense, stepped forward to address the assembly directly. I want to add something to what Surzex-sama said, he said. Lord Glagialabalas is right that the Juggernaut Drive is dangerous. I've felt that danger myself, more than once, in moments where I genuinely worried I might lose control of it. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, recognizing the importance of complete honesty in this particular moment. But every single time I've come close to that loss of control, it's been in moments of isolation, moments where I felt like I was fighting entirely alone, with nothing and nobody anchoring me back to who I actually am beneath the power. The first time I activated Juggernaut Drive without full control, years ago, it was because I genuinely believed I had no other options left, no support. Nothing but raw power between me and watching someone I loved die in front of me. He gestured toward the witnesses' gallery, where Rias, Akeno, Yasaka, and Vanalene watched him with quiet, steady attention. What this family actually provides isn't additional stress that risks destabilizing my control. It's exactly the opposite. It's the anchor that keeps me grounded enough to access tremendous power without losing myself inside it. Every time I've fought at my absolute strongest, with the most precise control, it's been because I had something worth staying myself for. I'm not asking this council to ignore the real risk Lord Glagialabalas raised. I'm asking you to look at the actual evidence of how that risk has played out across years of observable behavior, rather than the theoretical fear he's built his argument around. For a long moment, the hall remained silent, weighing the substance of both Surzex's technical defense and Issei's personal testimony against the rhetorical fear Glagialabalas had constructed. Finally, from the Citri gallery, Sona rose, her expression carrying the particular crisp authority that had made her one of the underworld's most respected young strategists despite her relative youth. I would like to add independent verification to what has already been said, Sona said. As someone who has fought alongside Issei Hyoudou through considerable crisis, including circumstances where his power genuinely could have spiraled beyond safe control, I can confirm directly what Lord Surzex and the petitioner have described. I have observed, personally and repeatedly, that his connection to the people he loves functions as genuine stabilizing anchor rather than destabilizing stress. Lord Glaciolabala's concern, while theoretically reasonable in the abstract, does not match the specific pattern of evidence available to anyone who has actually fought alongside this particular individual. Glaciolabala's expression had shifted from confident rhetorical momentum to something more uncertain, recognizing the weight of accumulated testimony now arrayed against his carefully constructed fear. He remained standing a moment longer, clearly searching for some further rhetorical avenue, before finally, reluctantly, taking his seat without formal withdrawal of his objection, though its persuasive force had clearly diminished considerably under the combined weight of technical and personal testimony. Graphia, recognizing the natural pause in proceedings, allowed a brief moment of settling silence before continuing. Are there further objections from this assembly? Issei felt his pulse quicken, watching the galleries carefully, knowing that whatever came next would likely determine whether the remaining proceedings trended toward the kind of substantive but ultimately surmountable challenges already addressed, or towards something considerably more dangerous. He did not have to wait long to find out. Chapter 16. The figure who rose next carried himself with none of Lord Glaciolabala's eager hostility, nor Lord Astaroth's careful rhetorical precision. Instead, a quiet, almost contemplative stillness preceded him, and Issei felt an unexpected chill settle over the hall the moment Graphia announced his name. Lord Dihauser Belial, of the Belial clan. Issei recognized the name immediately, having sparred with the man years earlier during a raiding game exhibition match that remained, even now, one of the most genuinely difficult fights of his early devil career. Dihauser was respected throughout the underworld as a formidable warrior and a careful, thoughtful strategist, and his rise carried a weight that the hall's assembled nobility clearly recognized, the murmuring quiet falling into something more attentive. I have remained silent through this morning's proceedings, Dihauser said, his voice measured and deliberate, not from lack of opinion, but because I wish to hear the full substance of the objections already raised before adding my own perspective. I find myself, having listened carefully, in a somewhat unusual position. I do not doubt the sincerity of the bonds described today. I do not share Lord Glaciolabala's fear regarding catastrophic loss of control, having personally witnessed Issei Hyoudou's discipline in combat. He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. My concern is different, and perhaps more difficult to address through testimony alone. My concern is the matter of time, and what this union asks of everyone involved across decades and centuries that none of us, however well-intentioned today, can fully predict. He turned to address Issei directly. You are 18 years old. I do not say this dismissively. I have watched you accomplish remarkable things at an age when most devils have barely begun their formal education. But the women standing beside you today have lived, collectively, many centuries of experience navigating love, loss, political betrayal, and the particular weight of long memory that comes with extended lifespan. I ask you honestly, Issei Hyoudou, not as an accusation but as a genuine question this assembly deserves answered. How do you intend to grow into someone capable of meeting that accumulated weight of experience, not merely today, in the flush of genuine young affection, but in 50 years, in 100 years, when the initial intensity of new love has long since settled into the considerably harder work of sustained, lasting partnership? The question landed differently than the previous objections, carrying none of their adversarial edge, instead settling into the hall with the particular weight of something genuinely difficult to answer, precisely because it asked not about present sincerity but about a future none of them could fully see. Issei was quiet for a long moment, recognizing that this question deserved more than a quick, confident response. He glanced toward the witnesses' gallery, finding Yasaka's ancient, patient eyes watching him with something like quiet encouragement, as though she too recognized this as a question worth answering thoughtfully rather than defensively. I don't have a perfect answer to that, Issei said finally, his voice carrying none of his earlier confident momentum, instead something more genuinely searching. I think if I claimed I did, that would actually prove your concern rather than answering it. Nobody 18 years old, however unusual their power or circumstances, actually knows what they'll need to become across the next century to meet 4 people of vastly different ages and experience, as a true equal partner rather than someone perpetually playing catch-up. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I think the honest answer is that I'm not trying to arrive at this union already finished, already equal to everything Yasaka-san or Vanalene have lived through. I'm trying to build something we're growing into that, slowly, imperfectly, across however many decades it takes, is itself part of what we're choosing together. He glanced toward Yasaka again. Yasaka-san has lived 1,000 years. She's not expecting me to already understand everything that comes with that kind of accumulated experience. What she's offered me, what all of them have offered me, is the chance to grow into deeper understanding alongside people patient enough to let that growth happen honestly, rather than demanding I arrive already complete. Yasaka rose from the witnesses' gallery, requesting and receiving Graffia's permission to address the point directly. I would like to speak to Lord Daihauser's concern personally, she said, given that I am, among those gathered here today, the one carrying the most considerable weight of accumulated time. She turned to address the hall with the particular calm authority of someone who had genuinely lived through a millennium of change. I have watched empires rise and fall, Lord Daihauser. I have outlived companions, lovers, and dear friends more times than I care to count across my long existence. I understand, perhaps better than anyone in this hall, exactly what kind of weight extended lifespan places on any partnership attempting to span it. She paused, her amber eyes carrying genuine, ancient warmth. I am not choosing Issei Hyoudou because I believe he already matches my accumulated centuries of experience. That would be an absurd expectation to place on any 18-year-old, however remarkable his circumstances. I am choosing him because, across the 2 years I have known him closely, I have watched him approach every difficult thing this world has thrown at him with a particular quality I have found vanishingly rare across my entire long life. Genuine humility paired with genuine courage. He does not pretend to already understand what he has not yet lived through. But he also does not shrink from the work of trying to understand it, patiently, honestly, across however much time it requires. She glanced toward Issei with quiet, fierce affection. I have watched centuries of suitors, Lord Daihauser, devils and gods and yokai alike, who arrived already convinced of their own readiness, already certain they understood exactly what partnership with someone of my experience required. Every single one of them, without exception, proved considerably less prepared than their confidence suggested. Issei Hyoudou has never once made that mistake. He asks. He listens. He grows, visibly, month over month, in exactly the patient, humble way that gives me genuine confidence we can build something lasting across whatever decades or centuries this partnership ultimately spans. Daihauser was quiet for a long moment, considering Yasaka's response with evident genuine thought rather than immediate dismissal. That is, he said finally, a more thoughtful answer than I expected, and considerably more persuasive than simple confident assurance would have been. He inclined his head slightly toward Issei. I withdraw my formal objection, though I will say, for whatever weight it carries, that I hope you continue approaching the considerable work ahead with exactly the humility Yasaka-sama describes. The accumulated weight of decades is not something any partnership navigates perfectly. But approached honestly, as you both describe, I believe it can be navigated well enough to matter. He took his seat, and Issei felt something complicated settle in his chest, gratitude mixed with the genuine, sobering weight of recognizing that Daihauser's question had touched something real and difficult that no amount of present conviction could fully resolve, only patiently, honestly grow into across the years ahead. Graffia allowed another brief pause before continuing the proceedings. Are there further objections from this assembly? This time, the silence stretched longer, several galleries exchanging glances that suggested genuine deliberation rather than immediate further challenge. Issei allowed himself a small, cautious breath of hope, daring to believe the hardest portion of the hearing might already lay behind them. He was wrong. From the gallery representing the old Vampire Council's broader political faction, a figure Issei did not immediately recognize rose, carrying an expression of cold, calculated hostility that immediately set Issei's instincts on alert in a way none of the previous, more genuinely deliberative objections had managed. Lord Marcosius of the Vampire Council's Eastern Delegation, Grafia announced, and Issei caught, in his peripheral vision, Vanalene's posture stiffening sharply, recognizing something about this particular opponent that clearly concerned her considerably more than anything that had preceded it. Chapter 17. Lord Marcosius, Vanalene murmured, low enough that only Issei could hear, her composed expression carrying genuine, careful alarm. He led the faction within the old Vampire Council that orchestrated my previous broken engagement, the one my grandmother mentioned. He has personal history with my family that goes considerably beyond simple political disagreement. Issei's jaw tightened, understanding immediately that whatever came next would carry an edge sharper than the previous, more genuinely deliberative objections. I have listened with great patience, Marcosius began, his voice carrying a cold, precise quality that immediately distinguished him from the more rhetorically heated Glaciolabilas, to this assembly's growing enthusiasm for what I can only describe as a remarkably well-orchestrated narrative of sincere young love overcoming careful institutional skepticism. I confess I find myself considerably less moved than my colleagues appear to be. His gaze settled on Vanalene with an expression of barely concealed contempt. Perhaps because I have watched this particular young woman's romantic entanglements unfold before, and I recall, with considerably more clarity than this assembly's current sentiment suggests anyone else does, exactly how her previous engagement concluded. That engagement, Vanalene said, rising from the witnesses' gallery with visible, controlled anger, concluded precisely because your faction orchestrated it for political advantage, Lord Marcosius, with no genuine concern for my own wishes whatsoever. I would caution this assembly against treating your characterization of that history as neutral testimony. I make no claim to neutrality, Marcosius said smoothly. I claim only relevant historical context. The Carmilla faction's junior nobility has a documented pattern of forming intense, seemingly genuine romantic attachments that ultimately prove considerably less stable than initial appearances suggest, once the practical pressures of formal political union actually arrive. He turned back to address the broader hall. I do not say this to cast aspersions on the petitioner's character specifically. I say this because this assembly is being asked to grant formal, lasting ratification based substantially on testimony from individuals whose own track record regarding sustained romantic commitment carries genuine, documented complexity. The accusation, unlike the previous objections, carried an edge of genuine cruelty beneath its formal presentation, and Issei felt anger rise sharp and immediate, watching Vanalene's careful composure strain visibly under an attack that clearly touched old, painful wounds. That's enough, Issei said, stepping forward before he had fully decided to speak, his voice carrying more heat than the formal proceedings typically permitted. You're not raising a genuine concern, Lord Marcosius. You're attacking Vanalene's character based on a broken engagement your own faction orchestrated and then sabotaged for political reasons that had nothing to do with her actual wishes. If this hearing is supposed to be about evaluating genuine evidence, that's not evidence. That's old grievance dressed up as institutional concern. Marcosius's cold expression flickered with something almost satisfied, as though Issei's heated response had confirmed some calculation he had made in advance. Interesting, he said. The petitioner grows considerably less composed when his intended partner's history is examined honestly. I wonder whether this assembly should consider what that reveals about the genuine stability of the bond being celebrated here today. Issei felt the trap close around him, recognizing too late that his protective anger had played directly into exactly the kind of provocation Marcosius had clearly intended to elicit. He forced himself to draw a steadying breath, recognizing that further heated response would only strengthen Marcosius's manufactured narrative. It was Lucretia Carmilla who rose next, her ancient, severe presence commanding immediate attention across the hall. I have remained silent through this morning's proceedings, she said, her voice carrying centuries of accumulated authority, withholding formal endorsement specifically to observe this hearing's substance before committing my considerable influence either way, as I told the petitioner directly weeks ago. I find myself, having now observed Lord Marcosius's particular contribution, no longer inclined towards such careful neutrality. She turned to address Marcosius directly, her ancient eyes carrying cold, precise fury beneath their carefully composed surface. You speak of my granddaughter's broken engagement as evidence of some inherent instability in her character, Lord Marcosius. I was present for the entirety of those negotiations. I watched your faction systematically undermine that engagement through deliberate, calculated interference once it became politically inconvenient for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with my granddaughter's genuine feelings or conduct. You orchestrated that failure, and now you stand before this assembly attempting to weaponize the very wound your own faction inflicted as evidence against her character. A ripple of genuine shock moved through several galleries at the directness of Lucretia's accusation, and Marcosius's cold composure flickered for the first time, recognizing the unexpected force of opposition he had drawn from a source he had clearly expected to remain neutral at best. Lucretia Carmilla makes serious accusations, Marcosius said carefully, without formal evidence presented to this council. I have formal evidence, Lucretia said, extensively documented, which I have until this moment declined to present publicly out of respect for my granddaughter's privacy regarding a painful chapter of her history. You have left me no further choice, Lord Marcosius, given your willingness to weaponize that same history dishonestly before this entire assembly. She gestured, and Graphia, recognizing the formal request, activated additional magical projections, displaying carefully preserved correspondence and political records spanning the years of the broken engagement's collapse. This council may review the full documentation at its leisure, Lucretia continued. But I will summarize its substance plainly. Vanalene's previous engagement collapsed not from any genuine failure of romantic commitment on her part, but from deliberate, documented political sabotage orchestrated by Lord Marcosius's own faction, motivated by territorial disputes entirely unrelated to the actual romantic bond involved. I have carried this knowledge privately for a decade, Lord Marcosius, out of respect for the genuine pain it caused my granddaughter. I will not carry it privately any longer, not while you attempt to use that same engineered tragedy as a weapon against her character before the full assembly of the 72 pillars. The hall had fallen into genuine, stunned silence, the weight of Lucretia's documented accusation landing with considerably more force than Marcosius's careful rhetoric had managed to build against it. Marcosius himself stood frozen for a long moment, clearly recognizing that his calculated provocation had backfired catastrophically against an opponent he had evidently underestimated. This is, he said finally, his composed voice carrying the first genuine strain Issei had heard from him, a significant accusation requiring formal investigation before this assembly can reasonably. Formal investigation, Lucretia interrupted, her ancient voice carrying absolute, unshakable authority, which I welcome entirely, Lord Marcosius. I have prepared this documentation for exactly such scrutiny. I would simply remind this assembly, in the meantime, that today's proceedings concern Vanalene's genuine character and conduct in her current relationship, not a decade-old engagement whose collapse this council now has clear, documented evidence was never her fault to begin with. Serzex, recognizing the moment required formal intervention, rose from his seat. Given the serious nature of the accusations now exchanged between these two parties, this council will formally table the historical engagement matter for separate, independent investigation, to be conducted with appropriate care and privacy protections for all involved. Today's proceedings will continue to focus specifically on the merits of the petition currently before this assembly. His gaze settled on Marcosius with quiet, unmistakable authority. I would caution Lord Marcosius against further attempts to introduce material that this council has just determined requires separate, careful investigation rather than continued public litigation within today's proceedings. Marcosius, recognizing the shifted tide of the hall's sentiment now arrayed visibly against him, inclined his head with stiff, careful formality. I withdraw my specific characterization regarding the petitioner's intended partner's character, he said, the words carrying clear reluctance despite their formal phrasing. I maintain my broader concern regarding the precedent this union establishes, which I believe Lord Astaroth has already articulated more thoroughly than I am presently positioned to add to. He took his seat, and Issei felt the hall's collective tension ease fractionally, though the genuine difficulty of what had just unfolded left a different, more sober weight settling over the proceedings than the previous objections had carried. Beside him, Vanalene's composed expression had given way to something raw and grateful, watching her grandmother with an expression of genuine, overwhelmed gratitude that needed no further words to express. Lucretia met her granddaughter's gaze across the hall, and for just a moment, the careful political distance the matriarch had maintained throughout their entire acquaintance fell away entirely, replaced with something unmistakably, fiercely protective. Graphia allowed the hall's tension to settle fully before continuing the proceedings. "Are there further objections from this assembly?" This time, the silence that followed carried a different quality, the weight of what had just transpired settling visibly over the gathered nobility, several galleries exchanging glances that suggested genuine reconsideration of whatever further challenges they might have prepared to raise. Issei held his breath, daring to hope that the hearing's most dangerous moment had now passed behind them, even as he recognized that the formal vote still loomed ahead, with its own uncertain weight yet to be determined. Chapter 18. It was Lady Camilla LeBlanc who finally rose into the settling silence, and Issei felt his pulse quicken with uncertain anticipation, recognizing that her testimony, perhaps more than any other still to come, carried the genuine weight to shift the hearing's momentum decisively in one direction or the other. "I had not intended to speak formally during today's proceedings," she said, her precise, measured voice carrying easily through the hall's careful silence. "I came prepared, as several in this assembly are aware, to observe rather than testify, having withheld my own formal opposition pending exactly this kind of careful scrutiny. But I find myself, having witnessed what has just unfolded, unable to remain entirely silent." She rose fully, her severe formal bearing carrying its usual centuries of accumulated authority, though something in her expression today carried less of its customary cold distance. "I will be transparent with this assembly regarding my own history with this petition," she said. "I opposed it initially, and vigorously, for reasons rooted in genuine concern rather than simple tradition. I have, across my considerable years, watched too many young vampires enter unions with mortal or near-mortal partners only to suffer decades of anticipated grief as that partner aged while they themselves remained unchanged. I raised this concern directly with the petitioner, privately, several weeks ago, expecting, frankly, either dismissal or empty reassurance in response." She paused, allowing the hall's attention to settle fully on her continuing testimony. "I received neither. Instead, Issei Hyoudou arranged, without prompting from this council or any formal requirement, a meeting with Ajuka Beelzebub's research team, where I personally reviewed extensive technical documentation regarding his own projected longevity, developed specifically to address the exact concern I had raised. I want this assembly to understand clearly what that demonstrates. This was not a young man performing sincerity for political advantage before a hostile audience. This was private, careful preparation undertaken weeks before today's hearing, addressing a concern I had not yet made public, motivated by nothing beyond genuine care for the women he intends to build this union with." A considering murmur swept through the gathered galleries, the substance of Camilla's testimony carrying considerable weight given her well-known prior opposition. "I will also speak," she continued, "to what I have just witnessed regarding Lord Marcosius's conduct toward Vanalene of the Carmilla faction. I have known Marcosius for considerably longer than most in this hall, and I will state plainly what many present likely already suspect. His objection today was not motivated by genuine concern for institutional precedent. It was motivated by old, personal political grievance against the Carmilla matriarchy, weaponized cynically against the young woman who has already suffered considerably from his faction's previous interference in her life." She turned to address the broader hall directly now, her voice carrying the particular gravity of someone whose testimony, given her documented prior skepticism, carried unusual persuasive weight. "I came into this hearing prepared to find precisely the kind of manufactured sincerity Lord Marcosius's faction has suggested underlies this entire petition. I have instead found something considerably more genuine than I expected, across every single test this assembly has thrown at it today." I watched Issei Hyoudou address Lord Astaroth's structural concern with thoughtful, substantive proposal rather than empty reassurance. I watched 4 women testify, independently and under careful scrutiny, to genuine, freely chosen affection built through years of demonstrated character rather than political convenience. I watched Surzek's Lucifer and Sona Citri offer independent, technical verification regarding power control that no amount of rehearsed performance could have manufactured. And I watched Lucretia Carmilla, a woman I have known for centuries and who shares my own considerable skepticism regarding hasty romantic unions, rise to defend her granddaughter against precisely the kind of cynical political manipulation this hearing was designed to surface and reject. She drew a slow, deliberate breath. I formally withdraw any remaining opposition to this petition, she said, her voice carrying clear, unmistakable finality. More than that, I formally extend the old Vampire Council's endorsement, in whatever limited capacity my own standing within that body permits. I do not do this lightly, this assembly should understand. I have spent centuries cultivating careful institutional skepticism regarding exactly this kind of cross-faction union. But I have rarely, in all those centuries, witnessed a petition survive this degree of genuine scrutiny this thoroughly. I would be doing this assembly, and more importantly the genuine bond one have witnessed today, a disservice by continuing to withhold my support purely out of institutional habit rather than honest assessment of the evidence actually before us. She took her seat, and the hall fell into a silence carrying entirely different weight than the tense uncertainty that had preceded it, something closer to genuine, considering reassessment rippling visibly through the assembled galleries. Beside Issei, Vanalene's composed expression had given way entirely. Tears she had clearly been fighting since Marcosius's attack finally slipping free, though her expression carried overwhelming relief and gratitude rather than continued distress. Issei reached over, taking her hand despite the formal proceedings, and she gripped it tightly, drawing visible strength from the simple contact. Graphia allowed the hall's shifted atmosphere to settle before continuing. Are there further objections from this assembly? The silence stretched longer this time, considerably longer. The weight of Camilla's unexpected, thorough endorsement settling visibly over galleries that had, until moments ago, seemed genuinely uncertain about where their own sentiment might ultimately land. Issei watched the assembled nobility carefully, recognizing that whatever final objections might yet emerge would need to overcome a tide that had, across the past hour of difficult proceedings, shifted decisively in his favor. From the Bale clan's gallery, an elderly noble Issei recognized as a distant relative of Rias's mother rose slowly, her expression carrying careful, thoughtful consideration rather than the adversarial energy of previous objections. Lady Bale of the senior branch, Graphia announced. I do not rise to oppose this petition, the elderly noble said, her voice carrying gentle, measured authority. I rise instead to ask a final, practical question this assembly has not yet fully addressed, which I believe deserves consideration before any formal vote proceeds. She turned to address Issei directly. Should this union be ratified, what formal structure do you propose for managing the considerable practical complexity it represents? 4 separate factional relationships, each carrying its own political obligations, territorial concerns, and family considerations. How do you intend to govern such a household in practice? Beyond the genuine affection this hearing has already established exists at its center. It was, Issei recognized, the first genuinely practical rather than adversarial question the hearing had produced, and he felt a measure of relief at finally facing a challenge rooted in logistics rather than hostility or hidden grievance. That's a fair question, Issei said, and one we've actually spent considerable time discussing privately, precisely because we recognized it would need a real answer rather than vague assurance. He glanced toward Rias, silently inviting her to join the response, recognizing that this particular question fell within her considerable strategic expertise. Rias stepped forward, her composed, confident bearing carrying the easy authority of someone who had clearly prepared thoroughly for exactly this kind of practical inquiry. We propose a federated household structure, she said, modeled partly on historical precedent from mixed unions that succeeded across previous centuries, and partly on practical innovations suited to our particular circumstances. Each faction retains full sovereign authority over its own territorial and political affairs, exactly as the Yukai Elder Council's formal protections already established for Kyoto's district. Issei's role functions as connective rather than controlling, present and engaged across all 4 households without formally subsuming any of them into singular devil jurisdiction. She gestured toward a prepared document Graphia had clearly been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. We have drafted formal governance protocols addressing succession, resource allocation, conflict resolution between factional interests, and clear boundaries regarding decision-making authority within each domain. I would be glad to submit this documentation for the Council's formal review, recognizing that practical structure deserves the same careful scrutiny this hearing has already applied to questions of genuine affection and consent. Lady Bales studied the offered documentation with evident, genuine interest. This is considerably more thorough than I expected, she admitted. I withdraw my question, satisfied that practical considerations have received serious attention rather than convenient dismissal. She took her seat, and Issei felt cautious hope building steadily in his chest as the hearing's momentum continued, gradually but unmistakably, shifting toward genuine, considered support. Graphia surveyed the hall once more. Are there further objections from this assembly? This time, the silence held, stretching long enough that Issei dared, finally, to believe the formal objections portion of the hearing might genuinely be drawing toward its conclusion. Chapter 19. The silence held long enough that Graphia, after careful consideration of the hall's settled stillness, finally proceeded toward the hearing's formal conclusion. Hearing no further objections, she announced, this council will now proceed to formal vote. Each house represented within the quorum of the 72 pillars will cast formal judgment, requiring clear majority for the petition's ratification. A fresh wave of tension swept through the hall, different in character from the adversarial uncertainty of the objections portion, instead carrying the particular weight of genuine consequence, finally arriving after weeks of careful preparation and hours of difficult, substantive proceedings. Issei felt Rias's hand find his, steady and warm despite the formal setting, and across the witnesses' gallery, Akeno, Yasaka, and Vanalene watched with expressions carrying equal parts hope and genuine apprehension. The vote will proceed by formal house declaration, Graphia continued, beginning with the senior branch families and proceeding through established precedence order. Each house head will rise and declare their formal position before this assembly. The process, Issei quickly realized, would take considerable time, 72 separate houses each requiring their moment of formal declaration, and he forced himself to settle into the patient, steady composure the proceedings demanded, even as every fiber of his attention remained fixed on each successive verdict. The senior houses began their declarations first. Bale, through Lady Bale's measured voice, declared formal support, citing the thorough practical documentation Rias had provided. Citri followed, Sona's father rising with brief, clear endorsement that carried evident genuine warmth beneath its formal phrasing. House after house proceeded through their declarations, the pattern gradually, steadily emerging in Issei's favor, though scattered houses, including Astaroth and several aligned with Glagia Labilas's earlier rhetoric, registered formal opposition or careful abstention. It was nearly an hour into the formal declarations when the Phoenix House's turn arrived, and Issei felt a flicker of old uncertainty, remembering the complicated history that still lingered beneath Lord Phoenix's earlier withdrawn objection. House Phoenix, Lord Phoenix announced, rising with careful formality, declares formal support for this petition. He paused, his gaze finding Issei's directly across the hall. I will add, for whatever weight personal sentiment carries within formal proceedings, that I find myself genuinely moved by what I have witnessed today. My own son's broken engagement caused considerable pain to all involved, myself included. I find some measure of genuine hope, watching this hearing's proceedings, that the lesson my family learned through that painful experience, the importance of genuine consent and freely chosen affection over political convenience, has found expression in exactly the kind of careful, considered union this petition represents. The declaration carried unexpected emotional weight, and Issei felt his throat tighten, recognizing the genuine grace in Lord Phoenix's words despite the complicated history between their families. The declarations continued, house by house, the pattern holding steady through the hall's middle tiers, occasional opposition scattered among houses whose conservative inclinations had clearly proven resistant even to the hearing's substantial evidence. Issei found himself, despite his best efforts at patient composure, counting the running tally with increasing, anxious attention. When the Carmilla faction's formal turn arrived within the broader vampire delegation's portion of the proceedings, Lucretia Carmilla rose once more, her ancient bearing carrying its usual considerable authority. The Carmilla matriarchy, she declared, formally endorses this petition, and further declares formal recognition of Vanalene's union as carrying the full weight and protection of this estate's considerable political standing. She paused, her gaze finding her granddaughter's with unmistakable, fierce pride. I have watched my granddaughter endure considerable pain across her young life, much of it caused by political maneuvering she had no genuine voice in. I will not stand silent today while this assembly considers whether to grant her, finally, the freely chosen happiness she has more than earned the right to claim. Vanalene's composed expression broke entirely at her grandmother's declaration, quiet, overwhelmed tears slipping free as she watched the formal proceedings finally, genuinely affirm what she had spent weeks fighting to protect. The old Vampire Council's broader delegation followed, and when Lady Camilla LeBlanc's formal turn arrived, she rose with the same measured, deliberate authority that had marked her unexpected endorsement earlier in the hearing. The old Vampire Council's Eastern delegation, she declared, formally endorses this petition, setting aside this council's traditional skepticism regarding cross-faction union in recognition of the genuine, thoroughly tested affection this hearing has established. She paused, her gaze finding Issei's with something that, on her severe features, might have qualified as genuine warmth. I will add, for the formal record, that I withdraw my faction's historical reservations regarding this specific petitioner's character, having observed considerably more substance behind his sincerity than institutional habit had initially permitted me to expect. The declarations continued through the remaining houses, the running tally steadily, unmistakably tilting toward formal ratification, until finally, after nearly 2 hours of careful, exhaustive proceedings, Graphia turned to address the full assembly with the formal weight the moment demanded. All 72 houses of the quorum have now declared formal position, she announced. The tally stands at 58 houses in favor, 11 houses opposed, 3 houses abstaining. She paused, allowing the weight of clear, decisive majority to settle fully across the hall. By the formal provisions of the Concordat of Mixed Houses, this petition is hereby ratified. The union joining Issei Hyoudou of House Gremory, Rias Gremory, Akeno Himejima, Yasaka of Kyoto, and Vanalene of the Carmilla faction is formally recognized by this council, carrying full legal and political standing across all represented factions. The hall erupted into a complex wave of sound, formal applause mixing with murmured discussion across the assembled galleries, and Issei felt the weight of weeks of careful, exhausting preparation finally, fully give way to overwhelming relief. Rias turned to him immediately, her composed formal bearing finally breaking into genuine, unguarded joy, and Issei pulled her into an embrace that needed no further words to express what the formal ratification had finally, officially confirmed. Across the hall, he could see Akeno rising from the witnesses' gallery, practically running toward him despite the formal setting's usual decorum, and Yasaka following with considerably more composed but no less genuine warmth, Kunu bouncing excitedly beside her mother with the particular unrestrained joy only a child could properly express in a moment this significant. Vanalene reached him last, her earlier tears giving way to bright, overwhelmed laughter as she finally, fully allowed herself to believe what weeks of careful, difficult fighting had finally achieved. Surzex, watching the scene unfold from his formal position with evident genuine satisfaction, finally rose to address the hall once more. This council's formal business concludes for today, he announced, though his voice carried unmistakable warmth beneath its ceremonial cadence. I would simply add, for whatever weight personal sentiment carries from the seat of Lucifer, that I have rarely witnessed a petition demonstrate this degree of genuine substance under this degree of thorough scrutiny. Whatever challenges await this family in the years ahead, I believe they have already proven, today, exactly the kind of resilient, honest foundation that gives me considerable confidence in their continued success. As the formal proceedings finally drew to their close, the assembled nobility beginning the gradual process of departure according to ancient precedents, Issei found himself surrounded by the family he had spent weeks fighting to protect, the genuine joy of the moment settling into something he suspected he would remember clearly for the rest of whatever remarkably long life Ajuka's research projected lay ahead of him. We did it, Rias said, still held close in his arms, her crimson eyes bright with emotion. We actually did it. We did, Issei agreed, looking around at the gathered faces of everyone who had fought alongside him these past weeks, Akeno and Yasaka and Vanalene and Kunu, his parents watching with overwhelmed, proud joy from their own seats within the hall, Barakiel's quiet, satisfied presence nearby. Even Lucretia Carmilla's severe features softened into something genuinely warm as she watched her granddaughter's happiness. What happens now? Akeno asked, slipping her arm comfortably around his waist. Issei considered the question, the weight of formal political ratification settling into something steadier, more permanent than the careful, anxious uncertainty that had carried him through these past difficult weeks. Now, he said, I think we get to actually build the life we just spent 2 months fighting for the right to choose. The hall's great doors stood open behind them, autumn afternoon light slanting warm and gold across the ancient stone floor, and beyond them, Issei understood, waited the considerably less dramatic but no less significant work of actually living the future they had just, formally and irrevocably, claimed as their own. Chapter 20. The celebration that evening filled the Gremory Estate's grand hall with a warmth that felt, to Issei, like the natural continuation of everything that had built quietly toward this moment across the past 2 months. Word of the hearing's outcome had spread quickly through the underworld's social circles, and what had been planned as a modest family gathering had grown, by early evening, into something considerably larger, as friends and allies who had supported the long fight arrived to share in its successful conclusion. Sona arrived with her own peerage in tow, offering Issei a rare, unguarded smile as she congratulated him properly for the first time since the hearing's conclusion. I confess I had my own doubts, weeks ago, about whether this particular fight was winnable, she admitted, accepting a drink from one of the estate's attendants. I am pleased to have been wrong, Issei. Genuinely pleased. Couldn't have done it without your testimony today, Issei said. That meant a lot. I simply told the truth, Sona said, though her small smile suggested she understood exactly how significant that simple truth-telling had proven within the hearing's broader proceedings. I suspect you will find, across the coming years, that the truth tends to serve you rather well, Issei. It has a way of holding up under scrutiny that careful political performance never quite manages. Across the hall, Issei watched Vanalene deep in animated conversation with her grandmother, the careful distance that had once characterized their relationship now visibly, genuinely warmer. Lucretia's severe features softened into something approaching open affection as she listened to her granddaughter's evident happiness. He found himself struck, watching them, by how much had changed in the span of just a few weeks, old wounds finally beginning the slow process of genuine healing rather than continued careful avoidance. She looks happy, Akeno observed, appearing at his side with 2 glasses of sparkling cider, offering one to him with easy familiarity. Vanalene, I mean. I do not think I have ever seen her look quite this unguarded before. None of us have, probably, Issei said. 300 years of careful political distance, finally cracking open. He glanced toward Akeno, taking in her own evident contentment, the easy warmth she carried tonight that felt, in its own way, every bit as significant as Vanalene's transformation. How are you doing? Really, not just the polite answer. Akeno considered the question seriously, leaning into him slightly as she did. Genuinely well, she said. I keep thinking about my father's testimony today, how he stood before the full assembly of the 72 pillars and spoke of me with such open, unguarded pride. I spent so many years certain that part of my life would remain forever broken, forever defined by absence and old grief. Watching him today, watching this entire hall today, formally recognize and celebrate exactly the parts of myself I once believed were unforgivable curses. She paused, her voice carrying genuine, quiet wonder. It feels like healing I did not fully believe was possible, even after everything these past months have already taught me about what genuine acceptance actually looks like. Issei pulled her closer, pressing a soft kiss to her temple, and she sighed contentedly against him, the easy intimacy between them carrying none of the formal weight that had defined so much of the day's earlier proceedings. Near the hall's center, Kunu had commandeered a small audience of curious devil nobility, recounting her own testimony before the Yukai Elder Council with evident, theatrical relish, her small hands gesturing dramatically as she described facing down Elder Karasa Tenma's old suspicion with what she clearly considered her finest diplomatic performance to date. And then I told him, she was saying, her voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, that I trust Issei completely, and that my opinion matters even if I am young, and he actually listened to me. Mother says that almost never happens with Elder Karasu. She has been telling that story to anyone who will listen for the entire evening, Yasaka said, joining Issei and Akeno with quiet amusement, watching her daughter's animated performance with evident, fond pride. I suspect she will be telling it for considerably longer than this single evening, in fact. I would not be surprised if it becomes a permanent fixture of her personal mythology. She earned the right to tell it as many times as she wants, Issei said. That testimony probably mattered more than anything I said in there. It mattered considerably, Yasaka agreed. Children possess a particular kind of unguarded sincerity that adults, however genuine our own intentions, rarely manage to replicate convincingly. The Yukai Elder Council, and apparently much of today's assembly as well, recognize that sincerity immediately, in a way that even our most careful adult testimony struggled to achieve. Issei's parents found him not long after, his mother practically glowing with evident pride as she recounted, in considerable detail, how thoroughly impressed she had been watching her son navigate such formal and consequential proceedings. I barely understood half of what was actually being argued, she admitted, but I understood enough to know you handled yourself remarkably well, Issei. Your father and I were so proud, watching you up there. We still are, his father added, clapping a firm, affectionate hand on Issei's shoulder. Whatever comes next, son, whatever this whole complicated arrangement actually involves day to day, your mother and I are glad we got to be part of today. Glad we got to see it properly, rather than just hearing about it secondhand the way we usually do with this whole devil business. The evening deepened into easy, comfortable celebration, conversation flowing freely between gathered guests who, weeks earlier, had represented careful, uncertain political calculation, now settling into something considerably warmer, the formal weight of the day's hearing giving way to genuine, shared joy at its successful conclusion. It was nearing midnight when Issei finally found a quiet moment alone on the estate's familiar balcony, the celebration's warm noise drifting out through open doors behind him, the underworld's manufactured stars settling into their familiar patterns above. He was not surprised when, one by one, the four of them joined him there, exactly as they had the night before the hearing, though tonight's gathering carried none of yesterday's careful, anxious anticipation. We actually did it, Rias said, echoing her earlier words from the hearing's immediate aftermath, though tonight her voice carried easy, settled satisfaction rather than overwhelmed disbelief. We did, Issei agreed, looking around at each of them in turn, the weight of everything they had built together across these past 2 difficult, demanding months settling into something he suspected would remain, for the rest of his considerably extended life, among the proudest accomplishments he would ever claim. What happens now? Vanalene asked, her earlier tears long since given way to quiet, contented warmth. Formally, I mean. The ratification is complete. What comes next, practically speaking? Now, Akeno said, before Issei could formulate his own answer, I believe we simply get to live the life we fought so hard for the right to choose. No more hearings. No more careful political maneuvering. Just us, building this family properly, day by day, the way we always intended. There will likely be additional formalities, Rias added, ever practical despite the evening's celebratory mood. Ceremony planning, household structuring, the considerable logistics of actually merging 4 separate domains into functional daily coexistence. But yes, fundamentally, Akeno is right. The hardest part, the part requiring this much formal struggle and political navigation, lies behind us now. Yasaka, who had remained quietly thoughtful throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her ancient voice carrying gentle, settled warmth. I have lived 1,000 years, she said, and I have learned, across that considerable span, that the formal beginnings of things rarely mark their true significance. Today's ratification matters, genuinely. But what we build from here, the daily choices, the quiet moments, the considerable work of actually living this family into being across whatever years lie ahead, That is where the true substance of what we fought for will ultimately be found. She reached out, taking Issei's hand in her own, the gesture carrying the same quiet certainty it always had since the earliest days of their acquaintance. Today, we proved to the 72 pillars, and perhaps more importantly to ourselves, that what we have built together deserves formal recognition. Tomorrow, and every day after, we get the considerably more meaningful work of proving it to each other, again and again, across whatever this remarkably long life ahead actually holds. The 5 of them stood together beneath the same familiar stars, the celebration's warm noise continuing behind them, and Issei found himself struck, watching each of their faces in the soft evening light, by how completely the impossible question Surzex had posed 2 months earlier had finally, fully resolved itself into something steadier than any fear he had once carried about it. He had chosen them. Properly, deliberately, with open eyes and full understanding of every difficulty the choice required. And now, formally recognized by the considerable weight of underworld law and tradition, that choice belonged to all of them, irrevocably, ready to be built into whatever remarkable future their considerably extended lives together still held in store. Chapter 21. 3 weeks after the formal ratification, Issei stood in what had once been simply the Occult Research Club's old schoolhouse and was now, by careful mutual agreement among everyone involved, beginning its transformation into something new entirely. Workers from across all 4 factions moved through the building's familiar halls, expanding rooms, reinforcing old structures with careful combinations of devil, yokai, and vampire architectural magic, building towards something that would, within another month, become the physical heart of the household they had all fought so hard to formally establish. It is strange, Rias said, joining him in the building's central hall, watching the careful construction work unfold around them, to think this building is becoming something more permanent now. I spent so many years here as simply club headquarters, temporary in its way, even as it became more central to my actual life than anywhere else. Does it feel like a loss? Issei asked, genuinely curious. Losing that temporary quality, I mean. Rias considered the question seriously, watching as workers carefully extended the building's east wing toward what would become, according to the careful architectural plans Vanalene had helped design, a dedicated space honoring vampire aesthetic traditions alongside the existing devil and yokai-influenced sections. No, she said finally. I think, if anything, it feels like the building finally becoming honest about what it always actually was. A home, not merely headquarters. I simply did not have the language, all those years ago, to recognize that truth as clearly as I do now. They walked together through the expanding structure, Issei marveling at how thoroughly the building's character was already shifting to reflect the considerable diversity of traditions now woven into its design. A section near the western wing carried unmistakable touches of Kyoto's architectural elegance, Yasaka having personally overseen its careful construction to ensure Kunu would have a space that felt genuinely connected to her cultural heritage even while living primarily in the human world's devil territory. The eastern wing, still under construction, would eventually house Vanalene's particular aesthetic preferences, dark elegant stonework softened by the same pale climbing roses that had characterized her original estate. Kunu has already claimed her room, Yasaka said, finding them partway through their tour, amusement evident in her voice. She informed the construction workers, in considerable detail, exactly how she wanted the space arranged, citing what she called essential air requirements that I suspect she invented entirely on the spot. What kind of essential air requirements? Issei asked, grinning. A window facing east, for what she describes as proper morning fox spirit energy alignment. Sufficient floor space for what she calls strategic planning purposes, which I strongly suspect actually means space for elaborate pillow fort construction. And Yasaka added, her amber eyes carrying particular fond exasperation, explicit proximity to what she termed the Ota-san wing, which I gather refers to wherever you intend to primarily reside within this expanding structure. Issei laughed, warmth spreading through his chest at the easy, casual mention of a title that, weeks ago, had still carried the formal weight of careful negotiation and hearing testimony, now simply settled into comfortable daily reality. They found Akeno in what would eventually become a shared kitchen space, currently still mostly exposed framework, sketching out careful plans with one of the project's lead architects regarding traditional shrine elements she wanted incorporated into the household's spiritual practice spaces. My father has offered to help consecrate this section properly. Once construction reaches that stage, she explained, glancing up from her sketches as they approached. It felt important to me, having a space here that honors both halves of my heritage properly, rather than simply defaulting entirely to devil architectural tradition. That's important, Issei agreed. I want this place to actually reflect everyone who's building a life here, not just whatever felt most convenient to construct first. I know, Akeno said, her smile carrying genuine warmth. That is precisely why I felt comfortable asking for the space in the first place. They found Vanalene last, in the partially constructed eastern wing, examining a section of stonework with the careful, evaluating attention she brought to everything within her particular domain of expertise. My grandmother insisted on contributing several pieces from the original Carmilla estate, she explained, gesturing towards several carefully preserved architectural fragments awaiting incorporation into the new construction. Pieces with genuine historical significance to vampire tradition, which she felt deserved a place within whatever permanent home this family ultimately builds together. That's a pretty significant gesture, Issei said, recognizing the weight behind Lucretia's contribution, knowing how carefully the matriarch guarded her family's historical artifacts. She has changed considerably these past months, Vanalene said softly. I do not think either of us fully anticipated how thoroughly this entire process would heal old wounds we had both, in our own ways, learned to simply accept as permanent fixtures of our relationship. She glanced toward Issei with quiet, genuine gratitude. I do not think that healing happens without everything you fought for these past months, Issei. Without the formal hearing forcing all of us to finally, honestly confront histories we had spent years carefully avoiding. They gathered together near the building's central hall as the afternoon's construction work wound toward its natural conclusion, the four of them standing amid the organized chaos of careful transformation, watching their shared future take increasingly tangible shape around them. It is strange, Rias observed, how quickly this has all started feeling normal. 2 months ago, we were facing down hostile pillar heads and ancient vampire councils. Now we are debating kitchen layouts and whose architectural traditions deserve representation in which wing. I think that's exactly what we were fighting for, though, Issei said, looking around at the considerable construction unfolding around them, at the careful, deliberate way each piece of this expanding home reflected genuine collaboration between traditions that history had so often treated as fundamentally incompatible. Not the dramatic hearing itself. The actual, ordinary work of building a life together, where ordinary disagreements about kitchen layouts get to matter more than ancient political grievance. Yasaka's smile carried centuries of accumulated wisdom, recognizing exactly the truth in his observation. The grand formal moments matter, she said. The hearings, the ceremonies, the careful political maneuvering required to earn this family the right to exist formally within underworld law. But you are correct, Issei. The true substance of what we built together lies in exactly this kind of ordinary, daily work. Choosing each other, again and again, through every mundane decision and small disagreement, long after the dramatic formal recognition has settled into simple, comfortable reality. As evening approached and the day's construction work finally concluded, the 5 of them walked together through the building's expanding structure one final time, each section carrying its own particular promise of the life steadily taking shape within these familiar, transforming walls. Issei found himself thinking, as they walked, of the impossible question Surzex had posed all those months ago, the weight of uncertainty that had once made even imagining this moment feel impossibly distant. What kind of house do you intend to build? He had an answer now, fully realized rather than merely hoped for. A house built from genuine choice rather than convenient drift. A house that honored every tradition woven into its foundation rather than demanding any single culture dominate the rest. A house where an 8-year-old fox spirit could claim her own wing with theatrical confidence, where a fallen angel's daughter could finally consecrate space honoring both halves of her heritage, where centuries of careful vampire political caution could finally soften into genuine, contributed warmth, where a devil clan's old traditional expectations could finally expand to embrace something considerably more honest than narrow convention had ever permitted before. A house, quite simply, built for a family that had chosen, deliberately and against considerable opposition, to become exactly and fully themselves, together, for whatever remarkably long future still lay ahead. The construction would continue for several more weeks yet, the careful work of physically building this shared future still considerably incomplete. But standing together in the gathering evening light, watching workers from 4 different traditions collaborate easily on the practical details of a home meant to hold all of them equally, Issei understood that the house Surzex had once asked him to imagine was no longer merely a question requiring careful, anxious answer. It had become, steadily and unmistakably, simply home.